Someone's in the back seat!
Who is that?
Now that I have my bride, we are gonna defeat all of the enemies!
When was the last time you fed?
I prefer a nice liver, but I may change my mind at any time.
It was the beginning of summer and Presley Pereira decided to go to their local amusement park. It was around evening time, they took the bus there, as one does. When they finally arrived and saw how high the rides were and how crazy the rides were, they were like, you know what, maybe let's not do that. Turns out they got a fear of heights, so they decided to spend the night playing carnival games. But they played game after game after game and they always came out empty-handed, thinking, okay, maybe I'm just bad at monotonous fair games, maybe I should just go home and play video games. So after all their unsuccessful tries to win the prizes, there was one game that caught their eye. It was this old, dusty-looking machine isolated to a corner of the park. Looked like one of those fortune teller machines that you'd see in an arcade, kind of like Zoltar. The game didn't draw much attention from the fair, so they're like, okay, let's give it a try. The game was called Psychic Clown, and it had a creepy looking clown inside, and the clown was quite realistic looking, like you'd shoved a scare actor inside. So Presley put some spare change into the slot, pressed the start button, and the clown began talking. It said, ask me a yes or no question to uncover the truth and then press the start button. So they asked, okay, will I get a girlfriend by the end of the year? Hit the start button, the clown began to move and started laughing in a very disturbing way, and then eventually said, no. Presley was like, okay, well, this can't be accurate, it's just a fair game. But the sad reality was, clown was probably right. So Presley was like, you know what, let's try something else, something more personal. Dropped in more change, said, are my parents divorced? Granted, their parents had been divorced for like 10 years at that point, so pressed the button. Clown began doing its little laugh and eventually said, yes. Now at this point, Presley was like, I'm a little creeped out. I wonder, is this a fluke? Is this for real? Let's try again. So they're reaching in their pocket, let's see what change I got left, realize they've only got $2 left. This is supposed to be for bus fare home. But they were like, you know what, I'll call mom to come pick me up. So they used their last $2 or whatever, a couple of bucks on this psychic clown. They put the first dollar in, they were about to ask a question, but then the game wasn't working. So they, bopped it a couple of times and then the clown began to laugh again. But this time it seemed like the clown was malfunctioning. It was laughing uncontrollably, it started jerking its body back and forth, just kind of vigorously. And the movements were so crazy to the point where the clown started like banging his head against the glass, causing it to kind of crack. Now, Presley was like kind of in a freeze moment. You know, those reactions that you get? Everybody else that was walking by was just sort of laughing at Presley looking scared at this game. And they were kind of disturbed. They're like, okay, maybe it's a glitch. Let's try this again. Put some more money in. And they're like, hey clown, will my mom pick me up from the fair tonight? And the clown begins to do its creepy laugh. And then it said no. And here, folks, this is where things get creepy. So Presley got a call from their mom right after the clown said no. And the mom was like, hey, are you on your way home? And Presley was like, hey, can you come pick me up? Mom says, yes, I will. And then the call cuts off. They figured, okay, phone has poor signal, we're not gonna call back. Mom said yes. So Presley makes their way out of the carnival. They're laughing about how the clown's prediction was wrong, and they find a spot. They're gonna like sit here, wait for mom. So a few minutes of waiting turns into an hour, and they're trying to call their mom's number. They're like, okay, mom, where are you? The calls are going straight to voicemail. They send a text, nothing. Eventually they call their stepdad, and stepdad answers the phone and is like, hey, are you on your way home? And when Presley mentioned that they've been trying to get a hold of their mom, stepdad's voice suddenly got panicky and he's like, yeah, I'll get a cousin to come get you. So like another hour later, cousin finally shows up looking extremely distraught. Presley's like, hey, like what is going on? What do you know? The cousin mentioned that he had just finished dropping off Presley's stepdad at the hospital because Presley's mom got into a nasty car accident. So cousin and Presley speed to the hospital and find out that sadly Presley's mom had already passed on from her injuries. To this day, Presley still ponders on like, did I have a hand in the fates deciding the event of that night? Oh, that accursed psychic clown. Veteran circus performer Chris Steele has been swallowing swords for quite some time, but back in 2018 he was seriously injured after an act went horribly wrong. Known by stage name Captain Steele, he has appeared with his wife and fellow sideshow performer Elena Steele on America's Got Talent, Ripley's Believe It or Not, but at this fateful event in Atlanta, when he was swallowing 13 swords at once, which is an act he's done like 100 times, he wound up with a perforated esophagus. So in explaining what happened, happened, Steele shared that during the trick, he pushes 13 swords down into the esophagus, then he spins them 180 degrees, and then up they go. That time though, instead of pushing through that, they pushed through the side wall of the esophagus, pushed it about 16 inches down into the chest cavity, and then spun it 180 degrees. So it's a miracle that he only perforated his esophagus and somehow avoided hurting any of his internal organs. Now, he went on to share that before the accident, he'd had an exhausting day, he'd already done 2 other gigs, and then when he finally went to do this particular feat, seeing as this venue had very low ceilings, he dropped to one knee to swallow the swords, which changed the angle of the trick, which, Now, he did mention he successfully performed this feat many times over like 10 years prior, but that doesn't make any feat any less dangerous to pull off. He mentioned, you know the possibility is out there, and then when it happens, you know how dangerous and how bad it could be. And although his organs narrowly missed getting punctured, he did continue to suffer from internal injuries for quite some time after that day. But at the end of the day, he did mention to news outlets he was recovering well at the time. The doctors were saying he did make some progress. He has returned to performing. Now, despite the scary injury, Steele, who has been, once again, doing this for quite some time, he was like, look, I'll go back to performing, and he did. He mentioned it's what he was born to do. He had too much unfinished work to quit, and like, ask any sideshow performer. Even if they get hurt, they'll tell you the same thing. By the way, the captain holds the records for heaviest sword swallowed and the most swords swallowed underwater, which is something I would like to see. A magician was taken to hospital back in 2019 after reportedly being struck on the head with an arrow during an on-stage performance gone wrong. This entertainer, who works under the name One Crazy China, suffered this injury at the 2019 National Arts Festival in South Africa. He was appearing alongside magician Brendan Peel in a show titled Carnival Sideshow and Other Magical Things, where the crowd was sadly asked to leave the hall after the arrow bopped Lau on the head during an illusion. Now, festival organizers said that Lau had been taken to the hospital to get stitches to the back of the head, and the art organization's chief executive, Tony Lancaster, mentioned to news outlets that trauma counseling was available for anybody in the audience who needed it. He said in a statement, "We are informed that the crossbow did not penetrate his skull. The performer is fully conscious. The festival deeply regrets the incident and is in conversation with the performers to establish what went wrong with the illusion." Here's the thing though, co-star Brendan Peel told news outlets that the story had been blown out of proportion by local media outlets. He's like, "I was not responsible for an error." He mentioned there was a crossbow involved, but the illusion was structured so it was impossible to be truly, awful. Also, once again, Li Lau, which is the legal name of the performer, was the one who created the effect. Brendan was just an assistant in the illusion. So at the time, the media was kind of painting it out like it was, really bad. And while the performers weren't going to go behind the curtain and explain how the illusion worked, at the end of the day, it was an illusion. There was a slight mishap, but both performers took all necessary precautions just to be overly cautious. All was well on both sides. The rest of the shows were going to continue as scheduled, but Brendan went on to say the entire story was blown way out of proportion and nobody originally reached out to the performers to make a comment. So in a statement that was obtained by news outlets, the performer who was injured said that they were all good and well following the minor mishap with the escape illusion. And they wanted to clarify, Brendan in no way was responsible or to blame and did not physically aim or hold the weapon during the stunt. The escape was something that he designed, he created. The two guys were not fully in direct harm's way. They did apologize for the scare, and they were overly cautious to make sure everybody was okay. During the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, 10 years removed from MKUltra and the illegal experiments performed by the CIA in that project, a new game showed up at arcades over in Portland, Oregon. The game had a plain black cabinet and featured a series of puzzles in different colors and geometric shapes. It didn't really have a name, but it was periodically serviced by different pairs of men in black suits. The game was pretty addictive, and those who played it afterwards tended to have a lot of amnesia. Stories say that at least 2 folks disappeared after playing it, and there's been a lot of other folks that came forward claiming to have been abducted by men in suits after playing. This game, which came to be called Polybius by those who knew of it, borrowing the name of the Greek historian famous for relying on first-hand accounts, disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. Take for instance Bobby Feldstein, who claims he was abducted one afternoon after playing the game at Coin Kingdom and experienced a lot of mind-altering side effects. Allegedly, he was led through a series of underground tunnels similar to the tunnels of Portland's Shanghai lore and was found the next day more than 60 miles from his house in the middle of the forest. There was another boy with him apparently, one who rescued him, and there's been many other stories like his. But nowadays, Feldstein gives walking tours around Portland that attempt to authenticate his experience by returning to the former basement of Coin Kingdom. He claims the ordeal of the abduction ruined his life, telling a lot of folks, "Doing a tour is a way to exercise my demons on a daily basis." So nowadays, there's a lot of questions around how is this allowed to happen and will it ever happen again? Ever hear about the toxic lady? Gloria Ramirez was an ordinary woman living in Riverside, California with a couple of descendants and a husband. A lot of her friends were like, yeah, she's friendly, she's a jokester, everybody loves her. But this all changed on February 19th of 1994 when Gloria was rushed to General Hospital in Riverside. That night, Gloria was battling a very rapid heartbeat and a drop in pressure. She could hardly breathe, and she also was answering questions in the form of incoherent sentences. Now, to make all of this even more unusual, she was just 31, but she had late-stage cervical cancer and was deteriorating pretty quickly when she got to the ER and passed less than an hour later. But here's the thing, she had a bit of a weird effect on the hospital staff. A lot of folks who treated her suffered from odd symptoms. We're talking fainting, shortness of breath, even temporary paralysis. 5 workers required hospitalization, at least one of whom remained in intensive care for 2 weeks after. So the medical staff, they took care of her. They gave her diazepam, lorazepam, everything to sedate her. And when it became clear that Ramirez was responding poorly to treatment, folks tried to defibrillate her, everything that you're supposed to do. But then they noticed like an oily substance covering her body. Other folks noted a fruity garlic-like odor that they thought was coming from her mouth. So like I mentioned before, the poor thing passed away, and a team wearing hazmat suits performed her autopsy, but they couldn't explain why everybody else had fallen ill. A lot of folks were like, okay, it's mass hysteria, until the coroner's office found that Ramirez had been trying to treat herself with dimethyl sulfone cream. When exposed to oxygen, this creates a vapor that affects people like poison gas. COINTELPRO, which is in a way a short form for counterintelligence program, was a series of covert and illegal projects conducted between 1956 and 1971 by the FBI that were aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations that the FBI perceived as subversive. So groups and individuals targeted by the FBI included feminist organizations, the Communist Party, anti-Vietnam War organizers, activists in the civil rights and Black Power movements, folks like Martin Luther King Jr., the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party, environmentalist and animal rights organizations, independence movements including Puerto Rican independence groups such as the Young Lords and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and more. Although the program primarily focused on organizations that were part of the broader New Left, they also targeted white supremacist groups such as the National States Rights Party and a more popular group that you'd normally list off by their initials, but we shouldn't say that, the white guys in the pointy white outfits. You know what I mean. The FBI has used covert operations against domestic political groups since its inception. However, covert operations under the official COINTELPRO label took place between 1956 to 71. However, the official chronology of the program is kind of a subject of debate. According to a Senate investigation, if this had been a short-lived abomination, the thorny problems of motivation, techniques, control presented might be safely relegated to history. But seeing as this organization existed for years on a quiet basis before the formal programs were instituted, and more significantly, these types of activities might actually continue to today under the rubric of investigation. A lot of the tactics used are alleged to have seen continued use, including discrediting targets through psychological warfare, smearing individuals and groups using forged documents, and by planting false reports in the media, harassment, wrongful imprisonment, illegal violence, and, well, taking them out. According to a Senate report, the FBI's motivation was protecting national security, preventing violence, maintaining the existing social and political order. FBI Director Hoover at the time issued directives governing this whole organization, ordering FBI agents to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of these movements and especially their leaders. Under Hoover, the official in charge of all of this was Assistant Director William C. Sullivan. Now, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy personally authorized a lot of these programs, giving written approval for limited wiretapping of Martin Luther King's phones on a trial basis for a month or so. Hoover extended the clearance so his men were unshackled to look for evidence in any areas of King's life that they deemed worthy. Here's another historical doozy, and that's the start of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1932. So black men in Alabama volunteered to undergo special treatment for bad human redness. They had seen signs in their neighborhood claiming that the government and the county health department would treat them, but what they didn't know was that they were actually signing up to be part of a study of untreated syphilis amongst black men. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated, though by the end of the study, medical advancements meant it was entirely treatable. Now, these men were not informed of the nature of the experiment, and more than 100 died as a result. There were 399 men who were diagnosed with syphilis and made to believe they would receive treatment for any symptoms of their bad fluids. Doctors in the area were told not to treat those in the study, just examine them, observe them. These men were initially told that the experiment was only going to be like 6 months, but it was extended to 40 years. After funding for the treatment was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they would never be treated. None of the infected men were ever treated with penicillin, despite the fact that by like 1947, the antibiotic was widely available and was the standard treatment for syphilis. The study continued under numerous public health service supervisors until 1972, when a leak to the press resulted in its termination on November 16th of that year. Its revelation led to the 1979 Belmont Report and to the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protections, and federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards for the protection of human subjects in studies. Now that whole office manages this responsibility within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. It wasn't until May 16th of 1997 when President at the time, Bill Clinton, formally apologized on behalf of the United States to the victims of the study, calling it shameful, racist, and so forth. And in our final legend for today, did you know that there's actual alien debris buried in the desert of New Mexico? The Atari video game, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, failed so miserably that the company buried unsold cartridges in a desert landfill. Wait, well, what do you think I meant? Real aliens in New Mexico? We would have opened today with this if I was talking about bodies, folks. So this whole burial was a mass burial of a lot of unsold video game cartridges, consoles, and computers in a landfill site, and this was all done by Atari in 1983. Since the burial was first reported, there were a lot of doubts as to, like, really? Did somebody actually bury a bunch of video games in the desert? And for a while, and for a very long while, it was just an urban legend. This was like a cultural icon and a reminder of the video game crash of 1983. It was the end result of a disastrous fiscal year which saw Atari being sold off by its parent company, Warner Communications. And though it was believed that millions of copies of this game were buried, officials later verified that it was like around 700,000. And it was various games, but E.T. was one of them. Well, in 2014, Fuel Industries, Microsoft, and others worked with the New Mexico government to excavate the site as part of a documentary, Atari Game Over. And on April 26 of 2014, well, the excavation revealed a lot of discarded games and hardware. Now, it wasn't everything that was found. About like 1,300 cartridges were recovered, with a portion given for curation to museums, and then the rest auctioned to raise money for a museum to commemorate the burial. And the documentary, which features all of this, came out in November of that year.
Number 5. Our first story was shared to Reddit by a user named Girl Porker, and is a story that'll have you uninstalling Snapchat if you haven't already. One day, Porker received a message from a contact that he didn't recognize. The snaps were innocuous enough, a little, hey, how are you? So he assumed it was a friend messing with him on a new account that he didn't know about. The account told him he should try out a new Snapchat lens called Eyes of the Underworld, which shows you the other world hiding beneath our own. Porker installed the lens and ran it through a bit, describing the lens as a pretty simple effect, saying it just distorts whatever is on screen and adds a few flickering sprites and shadow effects to the background to give off ghostly vibes. Porker assumed it was just, I don't know, marketing stunt for something, advertising something. But Porker said that a few days after, however, he'd noticed that he was sleeping a lot worse than he ever had in his life, complaining that he was having these violent, turbulent dreams where he was being pursued by shadowy figures that dragged themselves across the floor. This recurring dream happened to him 3 or 4 times. He said the dreams were stressing him, but what was really scaring him was how when he woke up, he would notice he had scratches and bruises that he couldn't explain appearing all over him. Porker said he was definitely getting scared and even considered looking into finding an exorcist just in case what he was dealing with was a true supernatural threat, which, understandable. I think if I woke up with scratches all over me, I'd assume demons were involved, or my cats. Porker smudged his house with sage and attempted to clean his house, but said that this only made things worse, and he started to hear growling late at night and experiencing intense bouts of cold sweats. And in extreme action, Porker destroyed his phone. He filled it to bursting with orange juice to fry the components and hucked it into a river to free himself. Miraculously though, it seemed to work. Porker said that after that the nightmares stopped as quick as they began, and all it cost him was a new phone. I would have tried a factory reset personally before chucking it into the water, but hey, we all have our methods. I don't think a ghost can survive a factory reset. And hey, If you're looking for more ghost stories about creepy technology and all sorts of twisted things out there, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. If ghosts aren't your jam, we got aliens, we got cryptids, we got conspiracies, we got true crime, we got fake crime. Basically, if it freaks you out, we got a video or two on it. So hit subscribe. Please make sure to hit that little bell as well. And I know this is a big ask. Would you kindly do that at the end of this video? Because I got 4 more scary Snapchat stories for you coming up right now. Number 4, the AI. This story was posted to Reddit as well. Recently, there was a new feature on Snapchat, which was that there was an AI that can talk to you. One day, I was in bed asking it absurd questions. Are you human? What is God to you? That's a very esoteric, absurd question to ask an AI. What is God to you? That is poetic. That's beautiful. It started to say, I'm sorry, I don't have access to this. I don't know where you are, and messages saying, it's just an AI and can't answer those questions. Can any of us answer what God is to us? Hard to ask an AI that. I had an idea to ask it to give me a location nearby. I sent that message knowing it was going to say it doesn't have access to where I live, yada yada yada. Here's a random location near you. It was a random set of coordinates. I copy and pasted the coordinates and I was shocked and confused that it was a field in Nebraska, my home state. I asked how it knew my state, but it said it didn't have access to my location. Days pass and I become bored of the AI, but the thoughts of these coordinates stuck with me for a few days until I knew I had to find the location. On a Saturday when I was off, I drove up to the location. I put the coordinates into Waze and drove where it told me to. And this location was in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out and followed my phone, and I was in a plain field with absolutely nothing. No houses, no buildings, no one. I looked into the distance and saw a small hill not too tall, and I thought that had to be it. As I walked towards it, I asked myself, was I expecting gold or cash? I felt embarrassed of all the time I was wasting here. I began to walk back until I heard faint cat noises, meowing. I turned behind and was shocked, and I walked back to a tunnel. This tunnel was covered in graffiti and it was too dark to see, so I shined my phone's flashlight. Right in front of me was a long, fleshy, skinless creature. It didn't look like it had eyes, but its mouth was a nightmare. It had rusted teeth and fingernails, and it stood there with its arm mangled. I ran back to the car. The next few days I couldn't sleep. I messaged the Snapchat team about finding illegal stuff, but I knew no one would believe me. I was so confused about how the AI gave me coordinates there. I tried to forget all about it until the next few weeks I started to see talk around town about missing construction workers all near a sewer. Blech. Number 3, the stalker. Michael Melanson is a former Marine and foster parent living in a small community in California called Kings Canyon. While checking his Snapchat messages, Melanson noticed something unsettling. Among these usual snaps was one that stood out from an unrecognized username. Intrigued, Melanson opened the snaps unsure what to expect. What he saw made this fully trained Marine chill. The message was a picture of Melanson with an unnerving caption saying, "See you soon." More pictures would get sent showing places on Melanson's daily routine. His gym, his favorite coffee shop, a close-up picture of the street sign where he lived. I would probably block that guy and actually chuck my phone into the river. I think that guy from 2 Points Ago had the right idea. But Melanson reached out to the authorities. It seemed like the Marine had a stalker. The police had advised him to save and document all of the messages as evidence, and they launched an investigation, although little came of it. Surprise, surprise. The snaps continued and grew more invasive. More photos of the neighborhood and frequent hotspots. It reached its peak when one of the photos was that of Michael inside his own home. Michael then fitted his house with security cameras and confided with friends about what was happening. He became hyper aware of his surroundings, constantly pinging and scanning for any threats. The stalker seemed to have calmed down and the messages were dwindling out. Was it over? If only. Eventually, the police were able to track the IP to a location nearby. The subject was a disturbed individual with a fascination with Melanson, a young man by the name of Riley Poeta, who worked at the bowling alley Melanson lived below and frequented and did most of his business in. He was taken in. The story is a modern-day horror movie plot, a reminder that not everyone in your neighborhood is as friendly as you might want them to be, and with the right information, anyone can get a hold of you. Truly spine-chilling stuff. Number 2, Thomas Sparks. Thomas Sparks was an amateur athlete who used his Snapchat mostly to highlight his athletics and daily vlogs about his life. A gymnast trying to attain as many world records as he could, and he might have broken the record for most haunted Snapchat story out there. Dubious one. Listen to the story he posted to Reddit. One day while browsing the app, Sparks uncovered a filter he hadn't seen advertised anywhere, which allegedly would show supernatural entities on camera. A joke, obviously, just meant for fun, sounds fun. Sparks uploaded a few videos showing off the filter, thinking it nothing more than a game. But as the days went on, Sparks noticed that even when he wasn't using his phone at all, he would occasionally catch glimpses of ghostly figures in his vision, vanishing when he tried to meet them head on. Sparks attributed it to working out maybe a little bit too hard and not getting enough rest and not drinking enough water. Stay hydrated. If you learn anything from Top 5 Scary, stay hydrated. Sparks said that after about a week after installing the filter, he began hearing faint whispers when he was alone in his bedroom, and even reported that some objects seemingly were moving on their own. A lamp moved across his bedroom, things not being where he'd left it. Sparks was growing incredibly paranoid, I think as most of us would be if we invited a ghost into our home. Thomas contacted Snapchat support, but unsurprisingly, they didn't have much to offer for him, instead only giving a generic message stating that the filter is just a playful feature and the company doesn't take any responsibility for any paranormal hauntings that could occur as a side effect. Well, they probably didn't say that, but hey, have you ever read all of Snapchat's terms and conditions? That might be in there. Nobody's gonna sit down and read all that. They might have something about ghosts. Out of ideas, Sparks deleted the app from his phone and claimed that he'd stopped experiencing any of the paranormal activity that was bugging him before, and has since not used the app whatsoever. What do you think, gang? Was Sparks telling the truth? Did he unintentionally become a conduit for spiritual activity? Or is he taking home a gold medal for creative storytelling? You tell us. Also, shout out to this guy just deleting the app. Everybody else went through all this like hullabaloo, but he was the only guy who just figured out like, oh yeah, I'll just get rid of this. Seems way easier than anything else. And finally, number 1. Snapchat stories can be a very mixed bag. There's good odds most of what you'll see is just sponsored junk, ads for IGN, models doing their thing, you know. But every now and then you come across something that catches your eye and hooks you in, maybe too far. That's what happened to James Brett Varney, an educator from Moncton, New Brunswick. Varney reportedly, while scrolling through stories, clicked on one from a profile he hadn't heard of called Unknown Realms. The story in question was a series of random, quickly edited, unsettling videos. Cryptic symbols, unintelligible writing and sounds, and quick flashes of people in dark robes surrounded by candles and ominous objects looking like a deleted scene out of Eyes Wide Shut. Varney was naturally unnerved by what he had seen, but brushed it off, assuming it was probably just, you know, promo for some sleeper indie horror A24 hit that your friends are all gonna say is really good, but you're never actually gonna watch. As time went on though, Varney found himself thinking more and more about the flashing images, saying that it felt like it was a dream replaying in his head over and over, and it was bothering him infinitely more than some stupid little Snapchat story should. He kept coming back to it to watch it over and over again to see if there was anything he missed. He said he felt like it was an invitation to some cult. He researched Unknown Realms for a bit, but wasn't finding anything to attach it. No project, no movie, no video game. James went to report the story to the authorities to see if they'd help him, but found that when he did, the video had been scrubbed from the app. Confused, James went on to research more into the phenomena, and found others online who claimed to have all seen the same mysterious story. No one was able to get to the bottom of it. Recruitment tool for a clandestine organization? Art project by some bored art majors? We might never know. A reminder that there is so much hiding on the boundless wild west of cyberspace we may never get the answers to. And you know what? That's not such a bad thing. Sometimes some stories are better left untold, some snaps better left unopened.
Number 5, Project Sunshine. There was nothing 1950s and 60s America loved more than dropping big nuclear devices and watching them go kaboom. From a plan to nuke Alaska, which could still happen, to actually nuking space, America wasn't shy about seeing some scenery and thinking, I'll put a mushroom cloud there. But in these early days of nuclear weaponry, we still didn't really know the effects these nuclear tests had on the human body. We had estimates on how much radioactive strontium produced by tests would kill a person, but the exact effects of fallout on humans and human tissue were basically unknown and unstudied. And what we did know about levels of strontium-90 worried scientists at the time, and yet, the world continued to test weapons. Project Sunshine was a series of research studies that began in 1953 to figure out the impact of radioactive fallout on the world's population. The project was initially kept secret and only became known publicly in 1956. Commissioned jointly by the United States Atomic Energy Commission and USAF Project RAND, Sunshine sought to examine the long-term effects of nuclear radiation on the biosphere due to repeated nuclear detonations of increasing yields. With the conclusion from Project Gabriel that radioactive isotope SR90 represented the most serious threat to human health from nuclear fallout, Project Sunshine sought to measure the global dispersion of SR90 body by measuring its concentration in the tissues and bones of the dead. Of particular interest was tissue from the young, whose developing bones had the highest propensity to accumulate SR90 and thus the highest susceptibility to radiation damage. It was in this environment that scientists at the Sunshine Conference, ergo the influence on the name, a conference that looked at the long-term effect of atomic weapons, argued in favor of sampling strontium followed in humans to determine whether potentially damaging levels of it were present in different populations. In 1955, there was a meeting of the Atomic Energy Commission, which came up with some of the specifics of the testing and urged researchers to use their own contacts to discreetly get a hold of tissue and bone samples without disclosing the nature of the research being concluded, nor getting permission of the deceased. Dr. Willard Libby said in the transcription of that meeting, which was only released to the public in 1995, that it is a matter of prime importance to get them, and particularly in the young age group. So human samples are of prime importance, and if anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will be really serving their country. Sunshine recruited a worldwide network of agents to find recently deceased little ones and then take samples and even limbs that were collected without notification or permission. Around 6,000 corpses from 26 bone collection sites around the world were shipped under top secret conditions to the project headquarters in Chicago and to a satellite research office at Columbia University in New York. In one particularly grim example, a stillborn's legs were removed by researchers in the UK, and the mother was told that she couldn't dress the stillborn for the funeral to conceal from her that the legs had been taken for the project. I can't believe I just found out about this for the first time today. Number 4, Project MKUltra. This is easily the most well-known theory on today's list. I remember hearing jokes about it while I was growing up without really knowing exactly what anyone was talking about. So this was a CIA program called MKUltra, which had the stated goal of developing biological and chemical weapon capability during the Cold War. Secretly dosing individuals with LSD in order to test the potential effects of mind control. According to Stephen Kinzer, the CIA project was a continuation of the work begun in World War II era Japanese facilities and Yahtzee concentration camps on subduing and controlling human minds. He wrote that MKUltra's use of mescaline on unwitting subjects was a practice that Yahtzee doctors had begun in the camps at Auschwitz and Dachau, and provided evidence of the continuation of a Yahtzee agenda, citing the CIA's secret recruitment of Yahtzee punishers and vivisectionists to continue experimenting on thousands of subjects. And Yahtzees were brought to Fort Detrick, Maryland, to instruct CIA officers on the lethal uses of sarin gas. Yeah, not shocked that this originated with the German bad guys. The project was headed by Sidney Gottlieb, but began on order of CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13th of 1953. The project began during a period of what English journalist Rupert Cornwell described as paranoia at the CIA, when the US had lost its nuclear monopoly and fear of communism was at its height. Although the practice reportedly continued for 2 decades, it was launched before the drug movement of the 1960s made LSD into a popular counterculture symbol, and more mind control techniques were discovered. During the program, the CIA established front companies to work with more than 80 institutions, such as hospitals, prisons, and universities. In some cases, academic researchers were funded through grants from CIA front organizations, but were unaware that the CIA was using their work for these purposes. With these partnerships in place, the agency then ran experiments on subjects using hypnosis, and verbal and physical torment. Many of the human guinea pigs were mental patients, prisoners, addicts, and body-selling workers, or one agency put it, people who could not fight back. In areas under American control in the early 1950s in Europe and East Asia, mostly Japan, West Germany, and the Philippines, the CIA created secret detention centers so that the US could avoid criminal prosecution. The CIA captured people suspected of being enemy agents and other people it deemed expendable to undertake various types of punishment and human experimentation on them. The prisoners were interrogated while being administered psychoactive drugs, electroshocked, and subjected to extremes of temperature, sensory isolation, and more to develop a better understanding of how to destroy and control human minds. In one case, a mental patient in Kentucky was dosed with LSD continuously for 174 days. So invested in LSD was the CIA that some have labeled the agency responsible for the entire psychedelic movement in the United States. At least 2 American deaths can be attributed to this program, according to the Church Committee. And though that committee uncovered much of this shocking program, many of the top secret files were ordered to be destroyed in 1973 by CIA Director Richard Helms after the Watergate scandal. But enough remains to confirm one of the wildest, least ethical, most unbelievable stories from the history books. And while being given some free acid might sound like a great time to some folks, or at least the plot to a bad movie, dozens of people were left with permanent disabilities after secretly being subjected to this. Goodness gracious. Number 3, Bohemian Grove. A secret organization of people that control the world? Well, you know what, it turns out it actually does exist, and many of its members are powerful world leaders and titans of industries. The real action happens at Bohemian Grove, which appears to primarily exist as a place where the rich and powerful go to misbehave, according to the Washington Post. Bohemian Grove is a restricted 2,700-acre campground at 20601 Bohemian Avenue in Monte Rio, California, United States, belonging to a private San Francisco-based gentlemen's club known as, you guessed it, Bohemian Club. In mid-July of each year, Bohemian Grove hosts a more than 2-week encampment of some of the most prominent men in the world. The Bohemian Club's all-male membership includes artists and musicians, as well as many prominent business leaders, government officials, former US presidents, senior media executives, and people of power. Members may invite guests for either the Spring Jinx in June or main July encampments, schedule private day use events when it's not being used for club-wide purposes, and they are allowed at these times to bring spouses, family, and friends, although female and minor guests must be off the property by 9 or 10 o'clock at night. After 40 years of membership, the men earn Old Guard status, giving them reserved seating at the Grove's daily talks, as well as other perks. Former US President Herbert Hoover was inducted into the Old Guard on March 4th of 1953 because he had joined the club exactly 40 years prior. The club motto is, "Weaving spiders come not here," which implies that outside concerns and business deals are to be left outside, although discussion of business often occurs between pairs of members. Important political and business deals have been developed at the Grove, notably a Manhattan Project planning meeting that took place there in September of 1942, subsequently leading to the atomic explosive device. Those attending this meeting included Ernest Lawrence, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the S1 executive committee heads such as the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, along with representatives of Standard Oil and General Electric, as well as various military officials. At the time, Oppenheimer was not an S1 member, although Lawrence and Oppenheimer hosted the meeting. Grove members take particular pride in this event and often relate the story to new attendees. Other behavior at the campground has led to numerous claims, with President Richard Nixon's comments from May 13th of 1971, calling it the most, insert F-word slur for gay here, goddamn thing you could ever imagine. I swear finding a way to say curse words without getting dinged by YouTube rules is like writing a crossword puzzle. Oh, to be a fly on the wall on any one of those meetings though. Number 2, poisoning booze during Prohibition. If you wake up with a hangover in today's day and age, you might be tempted to curse everything under the sun, to the tune of, who did this to me? And while the only correct answer is yourself, in the past you actually could have blamed the government. For over a decade, the United States barred the production and sale of drinking alcohol in what became known as the Prohibition era. An abstinence movement had existed in the United States since at least the 1830s, culminating in the adjustment of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in January of 1920 to make drinking legal again. At the time, manufacturers of industrial alcohol had been mixing their product with dangerous chemicals for years prior to Prohibition. But between 1926 to 1933, the federal government pushed manufacturers to use stronger poisons to discourage bootleggers from turning the alcohol into moonshine. Officials reasoned that by mandating toxic additives into products, which would be converted to bootleg alcohol, the supply could effectively be, cut before consumption. Oftentimes folks were drinking industrial methanol, otherwise known as wood alcohol, which was a legal but extremely dangerous poison. The federal government had required companies to denature industrial alcohol to make it undrinkable as early as 1906. But during Prohibition, it ordered them to add quinine, methyl alcohol, and other toxic chemicals as a further deterrent. While increasing pressure from sellers and illegal importation of alcohol somewhat limited the supply of beverages, demand remained strong, with speakeasies and smuggling networks arising as quickly as they were squashed. Think of it like a really wild game of whack-a-mole. New York's 21 Club, a speakeasy, had an elaborate system of levers to hide the bar shelves and tip incriminating liquor bottles into the sewer in case of a right. High demand for alcohol, accompanied by an unregulated black market, meant that sales of now toxic bootleg liquors continued despite the additional poison. By the end of the decade though, officials in the federal government adapted their strategies for enforcing Prohibition. In 1929, enforcement of Prohibition transferred from the Internal Revenue Service to the Justice Department, which then launched massive crackdowns on organized crime in cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. It wasn't until the repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933, which I already mentioned, that the federal government reversed course on its temperance policies. By the end of Prohibition, more than 10,000 Americans had been killed by tainted booze though. Number 1, Canadian gaydar. So while Canada as a country legalized gay marriage a whole decade before the United States, we haven't always been the most progressive about it. In the 1960s, Canada was actually so paranoid that the government developed what they called a fruit machine, and today was when I learned the origin of the derogatory use of the word. I knew of its use in queer contexts before, but never like the origin. It was developed by a psychology professor with Carleton University, and the subjects were made to view sexy gay videos. The device then measured the diameter of the pupils of the eyes, perspiration, and pulse for a supposed erotic response. The machine was employed in the 1950s and 60s during a campaign to eliminate all gay men from the civil service, the RCMP, and the military. Thanks to the nonsense, a substantial number of workers did lose their jobs, believed to be in the 400-person range. Although funding for the project was cut off in the late 1960s, the investigations continued, and the RCMP collected files on 9,000 people who had been investigated. So the machine used a chair similar to that used by dentists. It had a pulley with a camera going towards the pupils, with a black box located in front of it that displayed pictures, ranging from, the mundane to sexually explicit photos of men and women. It had previously been determined that the pupils would dilate in relation to the amount of interest in the picture, in a technique termed the pupillary response test. Current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau offered an apology and compensation to those affected back in 2021, something I think was long overdue.
Coming in at number 5. Be made, the lost history recovered. Although many have sought these locations out, few have succeeded, which is why it's so exciting when one does reappear. Way back in the 18th century, a British tourist wrote down the story of a group of temples hidden under the sea in southern India. It seemed that a wicked flood subsumed 6, leaving the 7th still standing on the shore. For centuries, this legend stood as people told the tale of the curtailed temples. Then, following a destructive tsunami in 2004, the temples were revealed to the world once more. The coastline receded far enough that people could finally get a closer look at them, drowned so many years ago. The tsunami itself was devastating, so I'm not sure if it was the best trade. And let's be real, hidden temples often contain curses waiting to be unleashed upon the world. Something tells me that these making a triumphant return might bring some additional dread to the surface. Nobody go looking for hidden treasure now, you hear? Coming in at number 2, we've got the Maine Hermit. All the scariest stories come from New England, just ask Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft. With all of the iconic additions to the horror canon these two provided alone, there are enough urban legends to fuel Boston's surroundings for generations. But if you look a little closer at the yarns these legends are spinning, you'll realize that a lot of them just simply can't be true. At least not in the way that we could ever understand. There are no deadlights, no Pennywise the Clown, no demonic cornfields or Wendigo-infested graveyards, no mysterious fishman hybrids, no Miskatonic University, no Arkham. If you have proof to the contrary, please let me know. I would love to be proven wrong on this. But for now, we'll have to look to an actual local legend that was inevitably proven true. If you were the outdoorsy type, you might have made it out to Central Maine's North Pond area. You might have noticed that some of your stuff was disappearing without explanation. This kind of behavior went on for decades, with vacationers, cottagers, and campers all experiencing some sort of disappearing supplies. This led to folks believing that a single entity was sticking around and stealing their stuff. And guess what? They were eventually proven right. It was discovered that a man by the name of Christopher Knight had been living alone in the woods for upwards of 25 years. That's a long time to be living alone unbothered, but good old Chris Knight knew exactly what he was doing. Living off the land, largely, but also committing small-scale steals whenever he needed something a little extra. And he's probably living the life, too. In the end, he was a pretty reasonable guy. Most folks would assume that hermits are volatile and dangerous, but Chris seemed to have a good head on his shoulders. When confronted by a warden, he admitted that he was behind something like 40 robberies a year. An honest hermit, who knew? And finally, at number 1, we've got corpse decorations. It's a classic campfire tale that has evolved with the times. A secret serial killer uses the bodies of his victims to decorate an abode, or a twisted mortician convinces kids to gallivant beneath pieces of people on Halloween. It's been done in movies, on TV, and in video games galore, but there's no way this actually happens, right? Well, actually, it did once. It wasn't as malicious as many of the tales make it seem, though. There wasn't some crazed lunatic hanging a real body from the eaves just to get away with it, no. Instead, it was an accidental accentuation. Way back in the early 20th century, there was a criminal by the name of Elmer McCurdy. After dying, McCurdy was embalmed and carted around as a sideshow attraction all across Texas. People came from far and wide to see the preserved body of a notorious criminal. Funeral parlors, carnivals, and all sorts of cavalcades of perversion showed off the body. It was so well traveled that for a while, people totally lost track of it. Eventually, over 50 years later, the body made its return as a funhouse prop. Somehow, an employee of the New Pike amusement park saw this preserved corpse and said, "Yep, that's a fake body, all right." So Elmer went up and stayed up for quite a while. In fact, the only reason he was discovered to be real was that a crew member from a movie being shot on location tried to adjust the body for a shot. In doing so, Elmer's arm came right off. The man was just doing his job and ended up tearing a dead man's limb from its body. Oh my. So while it's unlikely that creepy Mr. Jenkins down the street is hanging real corpses from his oak tree, you better double check your props before putting them up. Coming in at number 5, bug-eyed. We love a good pun from time to time, but this one might just stick with me for the rest of my life. As a person who's worked at swimming pools and summer camps, I've seen all sorts of different stuff get into people's eyes, from sticks, rocks, chlorinated water, bird droppings, and of course, bugs. Hell, I had a gnat fly into my eye while I was biking just last week. But these are all things that can be removed relatively easily if you're careful. They're not trying to make a home in your ocular orb. This story from Reddit user Oscar Devine makes me want to scream, and you're about to find out why. It goes like this. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, you know, the gross trick that some kids do with their upper eyelids. It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick, gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and I saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos for this case for those interested. I mean, I for one am not interested. Walking around with a larva in your eyelid for weeks and not bothering to figure out what it actually was? What if it was like wriggling around in there? What if it decided to start crawling around and looking for food? This is the kind of body horror I would expect in a movie, not real life. Although, what is real life if not horror? Let's keep moving. Coming in at number 4, we've got some unwelcome tenants. This is a personal fear of mine played out right before someone's very eyes. The idea of a silent, sneaky, and altogether uninvited individual deciding that the nooks and crannies of my home are free real estate just drives me nuts. And the worst bit is you're living in blissful ignorance of this until something finally sticks out and other patterns reveal themselves. Those bumps in the night? That wasn't the house settling or whatever other explanation your grandmother might have given you. That was a squatter moving around in the dark. All that food seemingly going missing. It sure wasn't partially forgotten midnight snacks or your friends being greedy, if you know what I'm saying. Those times the motion sensing lights went off in the middle of the night. Not mice, raccoons, or squirrels. Boy, oh boy. User IEAMS85 told their tale in a thread about this particular occurrence. For about a year I lived in a house with 4 housemates. We had a pretty big backyard with a garage and a tool shed that we never used, ever. We also had motion detector lights. 2 of my housemates were very superstitious and believed in ghosts and spirits and such. They also liked to get high on different substances. The lights in our backyard would go off randomly. I assumed it was animals, my housemates were sure it was a ghost. One of them told us she'd seen a man ghost looking through our window when she was high on shrooms. They thought it was scary, I thought nothing of it because, well, yeah. A few nights later, drunk me thought I saw a man through the mesh door to the backyard. I just thought my mind was playing tricks on me because my housemates kept talking about the ghost. Eventually I moved out to go back to my home country, and about 6 months after that I FaceTimed with one of the housemates. Turns out we hadn't seen a ghost. A homeless man had been living in our tool shed for God knows how long. Gave me the creeps for sure. All this happening pre-pandemic is horrific, right? But imagine it happening now. You're always home, and they have smaller windows to get out of their hiding spot. What if somebody died while in your home because they couldn't get enough food or couldn't get outside and you didn't even know until you smelled something funny? That's not an experience I ever want to have. Coming in at number 3, we've got pus brain. Not 2 words you really want to see together, right? Well, just listen to this story from user Slappy McSlappenstein. It speaks for itself. When I worked in healthcare, I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department, he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst, but amazingly he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. So take your full dose of antibiotics, people. How are we feeling about this one? A little headache? Checking in on your sinus health? Because that is absolutely bonkers. This dude essentially had to have a brain enema because of the filth built up in his dome. That stuff comes back with a vengeance, like he said, if you're not careful. So listen to your local healthcare worker and finish your antibiotics regimen. Coming in at number 2, we've got the suffocation station. In a lot of creepypasta stories, folks who are left near some dangerous chemical or enclosed space often go mad. You know, self-mutilation, murder, hideous mutations, the works. In this story though, the folks put in an unsafe situation don't end up doing a whole lot of that. They just die, and they die quick. We live in a cruel world, and if the folks running companies aren't careful or tend to cut corners, a lot of bad stuff can happen. Take it from Reddit user Animator Spaminator. I heard this from my grandpa. He used to work in the oil/gas industry. His father actually owned the company. Anyways, they had these huge tanks full of some deadly gas that's heavier than oxygen. Some guy went down to measure the size of the tank, suffocated, and died. Another guy found him at the bottom, wanted to help him, and he went down after him, suffocated, died after falling off the ladder down. Third guy does the same. Eventually, my grandpa finds 3 dead bodies at the bottom of a large tank, all having suffocated on this toxic gas. They have vents in these tanks now, which is good. Yeah, the poor grandpa. Imagine strolling into work and discovering not 1, not 2, but 3 dead bodies. All because of an invisible assailant that robbed the oxygen from their lungs. And finally at number 1, we've got the Outback Backpack Killer. If I was ever to visit Australia, I would be on the lookout for killer animals, bugs, and temperatures. In fact, killer people probably wouldn't even cross my mind. However, as this story shows us, murderous lunatics can be anywhere at any time. User Passometer has this story to tell. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us have done. One of his friends told him that they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened, but afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, the man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. And now this guy has to walk around for the rest of his life with the knowledge that he slept in a death sleeping bag. Definitely the kind of story that ends up as the central focus of a true crime podcast.
Coming in at number 4, Nick at Night. We all remember Nick at Night, right? Late night cartoons that were pure amazing. Well, Reddit user Saint Sparkles had some pretty awesome parents who let them sleep in the living room on weekend nights, chill out on the couch and watch Nick at Night until they fell asleep. So one night during this most joyous of weekend treats, Saint Sparkles woke up on the sofa with a strange prickly feeling. It was like an instinct, something tugging at their sleeve saying, "Wake up, something's not quite right." Well, they bolted upright in a sitting position and their eyes quickly fixed on the front window. You see, our narrator lived in rural Georgia and there was a hell of a lot of trees surrounding their property. In the perfect light cast from the moon, they could see a strange silhouette, or a person, perhaps a creature, something standing in the tree outside their home. Their dog seemed to sense it too and quickly dashed to the window, snarling at the glass. Long story short, their parents heard the commotion, Dad flipped out and grabbed a gun, headed out into the forest screaming, "Get off my property." He found no one though, and Saint Sparkles quickly went back to their bedroom to sleep. Just as they were dozing off though, their gaze cast out of their bedroom window. The figure, it's there again, this time standing in a tree closer to the house. Whatever it was, he put a finger over his mouth and shushed, and then just like that, turned away and ran. Yikes. Next up at number 3, Odd House. This one is equal parts charming and insanely unnerving, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. Reddit user Memory Eater painted a beautiful picture of their childhood home in a time gone Ask Reddit thread from 4 years ago. As a child, they lived in a bizarre little house. It was incredibly tall and thin, full of quirks like 2 fully functioning fireplaces, a weird shower in the basement, and an old-timey rope-pulled dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to their bedroom. The fact that it was incredibly old also meant that it was falling apart and in short was a complete money sink, so their parents sold the house and they had to move. As Memory Eater was cleaning out their closet, they stumbled across something that they'd never noticed before. A strange attic entrance to their walk-in wardrobe. Of course, being an adventurous kid, they opened it up and headed up a strange set of steps. The first thing that they noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with weird red Christmas lights that seemed to have been recently lit. There was also a bed the place seemed lived in, an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and bizarrely a small mint coloured fridge which still worked. The strangest thing though was the bones. A lot of bones, heaped in piles in the corner, small, large, clean and white, scattered throughout the small room. 2 of them had been burnt black, and scrawled on the wall was a dark coloured bone-charred message, the word sorry over and over again. Someone had been sleeping over their head for 8 years, and what the hell, this is insanity. Well, they never found out who or what it was. Swinging in at number 2, Something at Sea. Yeah, this one is pretty damn weird. True or no, I don't know, but it's creepy as hell. Again, another military story. Told you weird stuff always happens to them. This one comes from Reddit user Engerby. The story reportedly takes place roughly around a year ago while on board the USS New York, operating somewhere remotely in the Atlantic. They were staging a mock military exercise with half the crew posing as pirates and the other seizing possession of their ship. While as their squad was heading out on a small boarding vessel, things got a little bit weird and a thick fog descended on their position. It was only meant to be a short 5-minute ride to their destination, but over 10 minutes had passed at this point and they still hadn't hit. They were lost in the middle of nowhere, as if they'd fallen asleep and ended up miles completely off course. Eventually, after the engine had cut out already once before, they came across a massive old rusted ship, like a cruise liner that had been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. Of course, they boarded it, but inside they found something even stranger. They found reams and reams of books, sketches of some kind in notepads, of creatures that weren't supposed to exist. Massive marine animals, twisted squids, ungodly whales, and a note. These are what I have observed on my 14-month journey. Well, of course, they quickly got the hell out of there, and for fear of sounding insane, they refused to report it to their superior officers. Well, worse things have happened at sea, eh? And finally, at our number one spot, my favourite ever Reddit story, sticky notes. Not exactly a horror story, but so much more potentially terrifying. 3 years ago, Reddit user rbradbury1920 posted to the legal advice subreddit about a strange series of events that had recently plagued him. It first began when he found a yellow sticky note in a handwriting that wasn't his own on his desk at home, reminding him to run some personal errands, but hadn't told anybody about. Very odd, but he chalked it up to something that he'd done in his sleeping state, half awake. A few days later, he found another sticky note in the exact same handwriting, telling him to make sure he'd saved his documents. He freaked out this time, but there were no signs of a break-in and no signs of criminal intent. The next time, he found another post-it note saying, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you, but it's important we do." What the hell? Well, he was convinced that it was his landlord, playing games with him, breaking into his apartment. He found a letter from when he first moved in, and the handwriting was seemingly identical to his landlord's. The big twist? Well, Reddit user Kakalak pretty much saved this guy's life. In the comments, after a thorough analysis of the situation, he concluded that his apartment was leaking carbon monoxide, and he was correct. Our Reddit user had been suffering from slow carbon monoxide poisoning and was experiencing hallucinations that led to him writing sticky notes to himself. If it would have continued, in all likelihood, he could have ended up dead. So, good job, Kakalak.
Number 5. Our first story, and not to give away too much of the plot here, but a lot of the other stories, came from a Reddit thread positing the question, what's your scariest Home Alone story? There were many good ones, but the literal top comment was this by Killer or Angel. It was an average night around 9 p.m. Me and my cousin are at his house, and I'm sitting for the night while my mom and aunt are shopping, and my dad and uncle are at the movies. We're just sitting there feeling strange. Something was wrong, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. I got up and walked to the back door to lock it. When I came back, I saw what was causing that weird feeling. In the window, there was a decrepit and homeless looking man just staring into the window looking at us. My protector instincts turned on. I pretended I didn't see the guy, and I told my cousin it was time to go to bed because it was too late. I took him upstairs knowing damn well there was a man outside that wanted in. Now at the time, I was 5'8" and only about 125 pounds. I did play football at school though. If I remember correctly, I went downstairs to grab a meat tenderizer and I turned back to the window. He wasn't there. I ran to the front door and made sure it was locked, and then I ran back upstairs and went to my cousin and sat down in front of the door. He asked me what was happening, and I told him it was nothing to worry about, that he should just get some sleep. I called the cops and then my dad. The cops said they were half an hour away and my dad was 45 minutes away. I heard a window shatter and the sound of boots. I told my cousin to stay completely silent and hide under the blankets. It was horrifying. I grabbed the tenderizer and waited. About 5 minutes pass and I hear the boots walk upstairs. I heard him opening the doors to my aunt and uncle's bedroom, then the bathroom. I heard him make his way to the basement. After what felt like forever, the cops burst in, kicking the door in, and got the guy. Turned out, he was an escapee from a mental hospital a full province away. That's literally like the plotline to a horror movie. Absolutely terrifying, but good on him for having that big cousin instinct and making sure that the cousin was safe. And if you're looking for more freaky stories in this sort of vein, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. If you want something else a little spicier than scary stories, we got aliens, cryptids, conspiracies, true crime, anything freaky, we've done a video or two on. So hit subscribe, please hit that little bell so you don't miss a scream. But would you kindly do that at the end of this video, because I got 4 more scary Home Alone stories coming up for you right now. Number 4. It's another post from this same thread asking about people's scary Home Alone stories. This one very likely is going to have you locking the door tight and probably spending the night with the blankets pulled all the way up to your eyes. I had just moved into my first apartment. It was around 8:30 p.m. and I heard the doorknob moving like somebody was putting a key in it and turning and knocking. At first, I got pretty excited that my at the time boyfriend was home, but then I realized that it was too early in the day. He usually came home nearer to 11 and it was only 8:30 still. So I looked outside at the kitchen window and I didn't see his car or anyone's car that I recognized parked outside, and that's when I started to panic. The doorknob kept moving for a few more seconds and then stopped. A few minutes minutes later, they had some piece of metal that they were sticking between the door to try and open the door. I freaked out, and I locked myself in the bathroom. I grabbed a blade from the kitchen to try and protect myself. I called the cops. Whatever was on the other end was trying to pry the bathroom door open for about 3 full minutes before they stopped. Interrupting the story a bit, can you even imagine how horrifying that would be? 3 minutes locked in your bathroom waiting for the boys in blue to arrive while someone's clawing at your door? This person is braver than I. For context, this video has been about 4 minutes up to this point. Imagine the entire video you just watched, but you're petrified and shaking in a bathroom. Anyway, back to the story. Eventually the cops came in, and they found an elderly man roaming my apartment with a crowbar. He used to live in my apartment, and he wanted a bunch of stuff back that we took when we moved in. Police told me he was delusional. I'm so thankful and glad I didn't answer to the door. To this day, my heart still skips a beat when someone knocks on my door. And mine too. I don't think I'm opening my door for strangers anytime soon. Number 3. I was home alone and my parents were out of town. We just moved into the house, so there was an empty lot next to the house with a half-built house on it. My parents were the types to always leave the door unlocked. While they were gone, I was watching TV when all of a sudden, the door that leads into my garage from the inside starts to wiggle. I put my TV on mute to listen and I see it move this time. I start freaking out and I'm kind of in shock looking for the phone. I can't find the house phone, so I search for myself. I remembered I left my charger in my parents' car, so now I am frantically looking for the house phone. Our house was pretty new, so my mom hadn't even put blinds or drapes up in the kitchen or living room. Again, no blinds, no phone. Whoever was wiggling the doorknob starts banging on the windows in the living room. I shoot upstairs looking frantically for the phone and also trying to figure out how and where I'd jump out of my house to get away from the maniac that's probably outside my door if I needed to. He then starts pounding on my door. I can tell at this point that he's using something metal or plastic by the sound of the thumps. I genuinely thought he was going to shoot my door open. I remember at that because I was mad at myself for being such a fool. I frequently talked on the phone, and I always just left it lying around. I never put it back on the base. I wanted so badly to push the button to detect where my house phone is, but I thought if he heard where it was, he'd break the window near it and take it. I then remembered I left the phone in my mom's room, and as I passed the hallway, I see her dad's old weapon in my parents' bedroom, a long arm. I find the phone and I call 911. As I'm on the phone, the window breaks. I'm upstairs and I am scared to death, and suddenly everything goes silent. I'm waiting in my parents' bedroom. Pitch black closet for what seems like eternity. I hear the sirens. Cops show up, but there's no one to be found. I figured they hadn't gone too far since the incident had just occurred, but the cops never found my tormentor. On the plus side, the company that built the house next to us hired overnight security for the house, which was definitely refreshing. Number 2. In fall 2016, I moved into half of a really old house. It was built in the 1880s, a stone's throw from the original campus of Indiana State, which is now a park filled with homeless people. The owners basically turned it into a weird duplex kind of deal. Anyway, the layout of this house was pretty weird. You walked in the door and you were in a living room type space, and then you kept walking and there was a doorway to a bedroom, and past that was the kitchen. No doors. Only door inside the apartment was to the bathroom and one that led to the shared basement. This is a terrible living situation, may I say. My first night there was uneventful. I was kind of uncomfortable because I hadn't lived by myself in a long time, and I was just sort of feeling lonely and on edge. I stayed up late and eventually fell asleep, but woke up around 3 in the morning. Cliché, I know. What woke me up sounded like a group of drummers were drumming on every flat surface of the living room. It went on for a while and I was completely terrified. It was just a cacophony of sound. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I finally gathered up the courage to get up and check on it. And as soon as I passed the threshold to the living room, it just stopped. Nothing happened the rest of the night, but I didn't get much sleep at all. A couple of days later, my friend was visiting and he was about to leave. We were standing by the front door to my bookshelf and I told him about how I was having trouble sleeping, and I told him that story about my first night there. As I was saying this, a book threw itself off the bookshelf and onto the floor 3 feet away. It had to fly past the dresser the shelf was perched and landed between the two of us. He just gave me a creeped out look and said, "I have to go." and I don't blame him. Eventually, I asked the guy in the other half of the apartment what was up, as he'd lived there for 8 years. He told me that no one stayed longer than a year, and they all reported the same stuff. For whatever reason, he said nothing ever happened on his side. Doesn't make sense, but there it is. And sometimes, you just don't get the answers, and that's way scarier. And number 1, do you remember your first job? Mine was a newspaper route, maybe yours was like a grocery store clerk or a babysitter. This next tale is a tale of babysitting gone deeply wrong. Perhaps one of the most infamous home invasion stories in American history is the babysitter killings in 1978. Lauren Strode was a young woman looking to take on a bit of responsibility and earn some spare pocket cash for the upcoming summer. She and her friends had a bit of a sitters club. On October 31st, 1978, Strode was looking after Tommy Doyle, a neighborhood boy while his parents were out, alongside friends Ann Brackett and Linda Vanderklok looking after one Lindsay Wallace. It seemed like it would be a fun night like any other in a sleepy town. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to the girls, earlier that week a mental patient from Smith's Grove Sanitarium nearby had escaped containment and was on the loose and suspected to be around the Haddonfield area. A quiet investigation being led by Sheriff Brackett, Ann's father, and a psychiatrist at Smith's Grove was underway to try and apprehend the patient, who had been incarcerated after killing his sister years ago in a fit of unprecedented, terrifying violence. The patient had disguised himself and was stalking the streets of Haddonfield and had come across Strode out of a psychotic obsession. He stalked the girl for days until eventually making his move, and then proceeded to invade the home of Linda Vanderklok and strangled her alongside boyfriend Bobby Sims. Strode protected the youth she was looking after, and thankfully both Tommy Doyle and Lindsay Wallace were not harmed in any way, and boldly attacked the invader with a knitting needle, subduing him long enough for authorities to arrive, where he was apprehended and returned to Smith's Grove Sanitarium, where he remained for 40 years. Strode remained in Haddonfield, where she lives quietly and would prefer not to be disturbed, looking after her daughter and granddaughter, and does not celebrate Halloween much anymore.
Coming in at number 5, Alisa Lamb. Alisa Lamb was a Canadian student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver who was staying at the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles back in February of 2013. However, her body was discovered in a water tank atop the hotel on February 19th. She had been reported missing at the beginning of the month, with maintenance workers at the hotel being ones to discover the body after guests had been complaining of water issues. Lamb's disappearance had been widely reported, with interest increasing 5 days prior to the recovery of her body. Interest peaked after the LAPD released a video of the last time Lamb was known to have been seen on the day of her disappearance by an elevator security camera. In the clip, Lamb is seen repeatedly exiting and re-entering the elevator, talking and gesturing in the hallway, and even hiding inside the elevator, which itself appears to be malfunctioning. The video of course went viral on the internet, with many people finding the entire thing unsettling. Now, upon the discovery of her body, questions were raised surrounding her death, especially in light of Cecil's history in relation to the other notable deaths. Her body was found completely naked, with most of her clothes and personal effects floating in the water next to her. The autopsy report was released 4 months later with no evidence of physical trauma and states that the manner of death was accidental. The investigation into her death had determined how Lamb died, however, it did not offer any explanation as to how she got into the tank in the first place. Doors and stairs that access the roof were locked, with only staff having the passcodes and keys. Coming in at number 4, the Icebox Murders. Charles Frederick Rogers was an American seismologist pilot and suspected murderer who dismembered the bodies of his elderly parents and put them in the refrigerator of his Houston home in what the media later dubbed the Icebox Murders. In 1965, Rogers was unemployed and living with his parents Fred and Edwina in the Montrose neighborhood of Houston. Rogers was often described as reclusive and was reported to have communicated with his parents by way of notes slipped under the door. Now, on June 23, 1965, 2 Houston police officers forced their way into the home after Edwina's nephew reported that his phone calls to his aunt were going unanswered. After searching the home, they found nothing. That was until they opened the fridge. Inside the fridge were the heads of Fred and Edwina, along with their dismembered limbs and torsos. Now, Rogers during this time was nowhere to be found, with police launching a search and a warrant was issued for him as a material witness to the crime. However, he was never found. In 1975, a Houston judge declared Rogers legally dead so his estate could be probated. The case still remains officially unsolved and Rogers remains the only suspect. Coming in at number 3, the Chicago Tylenol murders. The Chicago Tylenol murders were a series of poisoning deaths which resulted from drug tampering in the Chicago metropolitan area back in the 80s. The victims of the incident had all taken Tylenol branded capsules that had been laced with cyanide unbeknownst to them. A total of 7 people died in the original poisonings, with several more deaths in copycat crimes. Now on September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman died after taking a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol, with Adam Janus dying not long after. No suspect was ever charged with the poisonings. However, New York City resident James William Lewis was convicted of extortion for sending a letter to Johnson & Johnson that took credit for those deaths and demanded $1 million to stop them. However, there was no evidence that he committed the crimes. A second man, Roger Arnold, was identified, investigated and cleared of the killings. Laurie Dan, who poisoned and shot an unknown number of people in the May 1988 rampage in and around Winnetka, Illinois, was briefly considered a suspect, but no direct connection was found. These incidents actually led to reforms in the packaging of over-the-counter substances and to federal anti-tampering laws. Coming in at number 2, we have Brandon Swanson. On May 14, 2008, Brandon Swanson was driving his car home from celebrating the end of spring semester with his fellow students from Minnesota West Community and Technical College's Canby campus. However, on the way back, he drove his car into a ditch. He was fine and got out of the car and called his parents to get him. Unsure of his exact location, he told them he was near Lind, and so they drove out to pick him up. However, they never found him. Swanson remained on the phone with them for 45 minutes. That was until he abruptly ended the call after exclaiming, "Oh." Those were his last words. He has not been seen or heard from since. His parents filed a missing persons report the next morning, with the circumstances of his disappearance becoming a whole lot weirder, especially after his cell phone records were retrieved, which showed he had been near Porter, 24 miles from where he told his parents he was. This ultimately led to the discovery of his car near Taunton. Now, foul play has not been ruled out, but it is also believed that Swanson may have accidentally drowned by falling into the Yellow Medicine River. After extensive searches, his body was never found. And finally, coming in at number 1, the Bennington Triangle disappearances. The Bennington Triangle is a phrase that was originally coined by an author from New England called Joseph A. Citro during a radio broadcast back in the 90s, in which he labelled an area in southwestern Vermont as the Bennington Triangle, a place within which a number of people went missing between the 40s and 50s. The first person to disappear in the area was Mitty Rivers back in 1945. Mitty was a 74-year-old woman who disappeared while out hunting. She was guiding a group of 4 hunters up the mountain. However, on their way back, Mitty got ahead of the group and was never seen again. A search was conducted. However, the only evidence ever found was a single rifle cartridge that was discovered in a stream. Many speculated that she had drowned when leaning over to retrieve the cartridge. However, we will never know. Paula Weldon was next to disappear in 1946. Weldon was 18 years old and a sophomore at Bennington College. She set out for a hike on the Long Trail, with many people seeing her set out, including an elderly couple who were about 100 yards behind her. According to them, she turned a corner in the trail, and when they reached the same corner, she was gone. No evidence of her was ever found. The Bennington Triangle has baffled people for years, with it being discussed in season 3 of the television series William Shatner's Weird or What, as well as on the podcast Lore, which discussed the events of 1945 to 1950.
Starting off in our number 5 spot, the Dog Boy. This urban legend comes to us from Arkansas, and it's about a werewolf-like dog man who would roam around the town of Quitman, killing people and animals, but it turns out this just somewhat embellishes a true story. So in 1954, Gerald Beatus was born, and right from the beginning he had a bad reputation. As he grew up, he was said to be cruel and sadistic. Rumor had it that he would capture stray animals and perform some pretty messed up experiments on them. As he grew older, his cruelty grew stronger and he began hitting his parents. Then in 1981, when Gerald was 27, his father was found dead in his home. The paper stated that it was from an illness, but the townspeople believed he died at the hands of his own son. His mother ended up testifying against him in court, and Gerald was sent to prison. This is where he ended up dying sometime in the 1980s. People have said his spirit still haunts the house he grew up in. In many versions, his ghost walks on all fours like a shaggy dog, hence the title of the urban legend, the Dog Boy. In at number 4, the Pig Pen of Death. Yeah, this one's just really sick. So as legend has it, one man, let's call him Bob, tied another man, let's call him Tim, up to a chair and threatened to feed him to the pigs if he didn't do what he wanted. Tim refused to do what Bob requested of him, so Bob tossed tied up Tim into the pig pen. Also, I should mention, at this point, Bob had been basically starving his pigs. So as soon as Tim was in the pen, the pigs went after him and ate him alive. Yeah. Lovely. Apparently pigs like to eat us as much as we like to eat them. Now where this legend came from. A Vietnam War vet in Oregon began to raise some pigs on his farm as treatment for his post-traumatic stress disorder. Things were going well and the pigs being there really helped. The man's family even referred to these pigs as lifesavers. But then in 2012 the man went out to feed his pigs and he was never seen again. And no one knows what happened to him to this day. When his family went to look for him in the pen, all they found was his dentures and a few scraps of fabric from the clothes he was wearing, as well as little bits of flesh scattered about. So it's clear that these pigs ate him. For what reason? Who knows. The family doesn't know if he had a heart attack or if one of the pigs just took him down. But for whatever reason, this man's pet pigs completely turned on him and devoured him. Yeah, that's just so messed up. At number 3, Alice killings. This is one of Japan's most famous urban legends as well as one of its newest. It revolves around a series of murders that happened between 1999 and 2005. It's said that these victims did not know one another and that all of the killings were done in different ways. But there is one similarity that tied them all together, and that is the fact that a single playing card with the word Alice written on it in the victim's blood was found on all of the bodies. Now, that is the legend. The truth is that there is no evidence of these killings taking place. But these legends did come from somewhere, and that is from the story of a serial killer who did in fact identify who he killed by placing playing cards on their bodies. But this was in Spain, not Japan. And in the real version, the killer was caught in 2003 and was sentenced to 142 years in prison. So as there were similarities that this Japanese urban legend was based off of, it got blown out of proportion. But it gained popularity by being on the internet. Coming in at number 2, Corpsey of Staten Island. So this is one I've never heard before. If you live in Staten Island, then let me know if you're familiar with this urban legend. So apparently Corpsey is like the boogeyman of Staten Island in New York City. He was rumored to be a homicidal madman who was an escaped mental patient who would hunt children. Once he caught a child, he would drag them back to the abandoned ruins of the old Seaview Hospital. Basically, parents would tell their children this story about Corpsey to scare them into being good. But then in the late 1970s, Corpsey actually came to life in the form of a real homicidal man named Andre Rand, who actually did hunt children. Back in 1987, Rand, who worked at a state school as a janitor, was arrested in connection with the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome named Jennifer. In the same year, the state school closed. So at this time, Rand was homeless and lived on the grounds of the abandoned school. The school also happened to be close by the abandoned Seaview Hospital, so closely tied in with the Corpsey legend. Searchers then found Jennifer's body in a shallow grave on the school grounds, and Rand was charged with her murder. But that's not all. Rand also had a record of crimes against children that dated back to 1969 when he was arrested for trying to rape a child. And in 1983, kidnapped a bus full of children for an afternoon. Rand was charged 25 years for killing Jennifer. He was eligible for parole in 2008, but in 2004, police convicted him for another case from years before, and he was given another 25-year sentence. He will not be eligible for parole until 2037, when he will be 93 years old. That's pretty crazy. Alright, and before we jump into number 1, I just want to remind you guys to please show some love by subscribing to our channel, and make sure you stay tuned until the end of the video as I'll be answering your questions. And if you would like to be featured in an upcoming video, then make sure you leave those questions down below. And in at number 1, Charlie No Face. This urban legend is coming from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Charlie No Face was a cautionary tale for children. Parents told their kids that Charlie was a man who was foolishly playing with nearby power lines when he had an accident which caused his face to become severely burned. Parents told this story to their kids to keep them from messing around with exposed electricity. Charlie No Face was said to lurk around in abandoned train tunnels at night and made electricity flicker and turn on and off with his presence. He was also said to wander dark alleyways and deserted country roads late at night. This urban legend was based on a real-life man. His name wasn't Charlie though, it was Raymond Robinson. He had suffered a severe accident involving a dose of 1,200 volts on an electrical trolley bridge when he was a kid. His eyes were cooked into their sockets, his nose was burnt off, and his left arm was destroyed up until the elbow. This amount of electricity should have ended up killing him, but it didn't. Because he didn't like people to see him looking this way, he would only go out at night. But unlike the legend, Raymond didn't do any type of haunting, and he was actually very friendly to people he would come across. He would even sometimes let teens take pictures with him in exchange for cigarettes.
5 rats in the toilet. Urban legends about animals in sewers have been rife throughout history, with the most notable being the alligators and crocodiles in the sewers of New York, which for the most part actually turned out to be true. However, the thought of finding something in your toilet inches away from vulnerable areas of your body, well, that's something nobody wants to think about. While the alligators and crocodiles are a far reach, this legend seems to have some elements of truth. A toilet drain is just wide enough for a rat to climb up, first and foremost, with the animals being attracted to sewage lines due to undigested food in feces. They follow the pipes and boom, wind up in your toilet bowl. Back in 1999, a woman in Virginia got a nasty fright when she went to the toilet and found a rat there waiting for her. Honestly, I've never feared a toilet before, but I certainly do now. Apparently this has happened enough times for public officials to put out a warning. If you encounter a rat in your toilet, close the lid and flush. Godspeed. Coming in at number 4, the Bunny Man. The Bunny Man is an urban legend that originated in Fairfax County, Virginia back in 1970. The legend has many variations, but for the most part involves a man wearing a rabbit costume who attacks people with an axe or hatchet. Most of the stories occur around Colchester Overpass, a southern railway overpass spanning Colchester Road near Clifton, Virginia, sometimes referred to as Bunny Man Bridge. In the tale, an escaped mental patient takes to gutting bunnies and hanging them from the bridge, but later escalated to the madman hanging teens in a similar manner. However, the legend is based out of reality. Following extensive research into the Bunny Man, the legend was linked to 2 cases of a man in rabbit costumes threatening people with an axe, with the vandalism reports occurring 10 days apart in 1970 in Burke, Virginia. The first incident occurred on the night of October 19, 1970 by US Air Force Academy cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée, who were visiting relatives in Burke. While returning from a football game that evening, they reportedly parked their car in a field to visit an uncle who lived across the street. As they sat in the car, they noticed something moving outside the rear window. Moments later, the front passenger window smashed and there stood a figure in a bunny costume. As they drove away, the couple discovered a hatchet on the car floor. The second reported sighting occurred on the night of October 29, 1970, when construction security guard Paul Phillips approached a man standing on a porch of a home on Guinea Road. The man was wearing a white bunny costume and appeared to be around 20 years old. According to Paul, the man stated, I quote, "You are trespassing. If you come any closer, I'll chop off your head." Now, while neither incidents resulted in death or disembowelment, the thought of an adult in a bunny costume wielding a hatchet is absolutely terrifying. Coming in at number 3, we have Polybius. Polybius is an urban legend that emerged back in the early 2000s, with it concerning a supposedly fictitious arcade game called Polybius. The legend describes the game as part of a government-run crowdsourced psychology experiment which was based in Portland during 1981. According to the legend, the game apparently produced intense psychoactive and addictive effects in players, with the machines being said to have been periodically visited by men in black for the purpose of data mining the machines and analysing the effects. Now, while the entire legend doesn't quite hold up, there are some pieces that are actually based in fact. Brian Dunning, host of the Skeptoid podcast, did some digging and discovered that a 12-year-old named Brian Mara had become sickened during a 28-hour marathon video game contest in Portland back in 1981. Just a few short days later, the Portland arcades were raided by federal agents who seized cabinets that were being used for gambling. Add these 2 events and add some fictitious elements and you have the legend of Polybius. Coming in at number 2, we have Candyman. The Candyman is an urban legend that tells the story of a murdered slave who returns from the dead in search of revenge if you say his name 5 times. In 1992, a Candyman movie was released based on the short story The Forbidden by Clive Barker. This in turn sparked 2 sequels, as well as a slew of paranormal games that friends dare each other to play. According to the urban legend, if you look into a mirror and chant the name Candyman 5 times, he will appear behind you and kill you with his hook. Now, although this is a legend and you will likely not invoke him by saying his his name, there is some reality to the story. In the Candyman movie, after saying his name 5 times, Candyman breaks through the medicine cabinet in a bathroom in order to kill his victim. This part is factual, believe it or not. Back in 1987, the Chicago Reader published a story about Ruth McCoy, a woman living in a Chicago housing project who called 911 insisting she was being attacked. When responders arrived, they found her shot body, with investigators determining that her assailants had gained access to her unit by climbing through her medicine cabinet, which adjoins the apartments. The complex was supposedly built that way so that plumbers could attend to leaks by simply removing the cabinet to reach the pipes. However, this in turn resulted in people using this method to burgle and murder. Absolutely terrifying. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Cropsey. Once upon a time, Cropsey was a mere urban legend, the boogeyman of Staten Island in New York City. Cropsey was rumored to be a homicidal madman who had escaped from a mental institution and had a hook for a hand, who supposedly hunted children and dragged them back to the tunnel system under an abandoned hospital. Parents would often use Cropsey as a way to frighten their children into being good and staying close to home. The urban legend became so popular it inspired a 1981 slasher movie called The Burning, which very quickly became a cult classic. However, what was thought to be fiction quite quickly became reality. In the 1980s, Cropsey came to life in the form of a deranged killer who really did kidnap children. He was called Andre Rand. Rand was a janitor at the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, which would eventually be closed in 1987 due to corporate punishment and rampant sexual abuse. In 1981, Holly Ann Hughes did not return home after going to the store to buy soap. Rand supposedly pulled up, pulling Holly into his car and driving away. Then again in 1983, 11-year-old Thais Jackson was reported missing after her mother had sent her to purchase food. She never returned. She was last seen exiting the Mariners Harbor Motel in Staten Island days after Rand had been released from prison. Then in 1987, Jennifer Schweiger was reported missing, and her body was later found underground after a 35-day search. Rand was ultimately convicted of the crime. A documentary about the madman was made entitled Cropsey, in which they speculate that Rand may have been involved with Satanism and provided the children to be sacrificed. Ultimately, Rand was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with eligibility for parole in 2037, at which time he'll be 93 years old.
Number 5, my mom left me a set of tapes to watch after she died. Our first tale today was written in October of 2020 by user TJ Leah. It is narrated by a character named Nick, whose mother passed away when they were after a short and awful bout with cancer. Now this tale unfolds through a series of videos, milestones, in his life, all curated by his late mother, Leonora Stankowski. A seemingly ordinary concept, capturing moments on tape. Well, it kinda takes a haunting turn as Nick confronts the spectral legacy of his family. Leonora's videos, a loving gesture frozen in time, serve as a poignant connection between a mother and her son. The milestones, from the loss of a tooth to the trials of adolescence, are immortalized on film. A peculiar ritual, a glimpse into a life cut short by illness, reveals a mother's undying love for her crown prince. Yet beneath the warmth lies a chilling undercurrent that Nick is yet to comprehend. As the narrative unfolds, we are taken on a roller coaster of emotions. Nick's life is marked by tragedy and eerie encounters, all captured in the foreboding glow of the milestone tapes. The sinister entity that lurks in the background, whispered about but seldom seen, becomes an ominous presence in the narrative. The turning point arrives when Nick faces his own brush with mortality, a moment captured in a tape that unveils a grotesque figure accompanying his mother. A chilling revelation ensues, unraveling a familial curse that transcends generations, passing from father to daughter, mother to son. The entity, ancient and malevolent, feeds on misfortune, and it kinda plagues the Stankowski lineage. Now Leonora desperately attempted to break the cycle, and this was encapsulated in the final tape, but it casts an unsettling shadow over Nick's existence. This entity, drawn to the vulnerability of broken bones and shattered lives, becomes an ever-present specter, and a curse that Nick is now tasked with navigating, armed with only the tapes and the weight of generational anguish. The narrative's intensity peaks as Nick, now a father himself, grapples with the realization that his daughter, Phoebe, is destined to inherit the family curse. The story pivots on a delicate balance between the supernatural and the human, blurring the lines between nightmare and reality. reality. In a chilling revelation, Leonora imparts a solemn duty on Nick to protect Phoebe at any cost, regardless of the toll it takes on others. The narrative leaves us on the precipice of uncertainty, as Nick contemplates the gravity of his responsibility, haunted by the lurking presence that persists in the periphery of his world. Honestly, I loved reading this one, so I highly recommend. Number 4, my girlfriend would answer one question every night in her sleep. This next story is courtesy of author The Buffed, and while it's since reached multiple installments, today I'll just be discussing part 1 and leave you anticipating more parts. So, picture this. You meet somebody special. Things move quickly, and then the nocturnal peculiarities commence. Now, before you dismiss this as just another spooky tale, let's dissect the nuances that make this narrative more than just a run-of-the-mill scary story. Our protagonist begins innocently enough, spending nights with his new flame, but the tranquility of these evenings is shattered when his partner, in a half-asleep state, demands to be asked a question each night. A seemingly, harmless quirk, right? Wrong. It unfolds like a cryptic ritual, an unsettling dance where questions must be posed and answers extracted, if you will. You kinda get like a surreal descent into a psychological labyrinth. The nightly interrogations become more than just a quirky little bedtime routine. Yeah, they morph into a haunting journey into the unknown. The girlfriend, blissfully unaware during the day, becomes a conduit to a realm where questions hold an eerie power, and the answers aren't exactly what you want to hear. As the narrative unfolds, the tension tightens like a coiled spring. Now the protagonist, caught in a web of I don't know what, grapples with the surreal demands of his nighttime interrogator. The questions evolve from the mundane to the existential, unveiling a cosmic horror that transcends, anything I can explain. The climax, though, kinda takes a bit of an unexpected turn. We find out a very chilling revelation about the demise of our narrator's partner, and our protagonist is kind of pushed to the brink. It kind of also pivots from the supernatural to deeply human as he's contemplating the actions that kind of go against everything we want to believe in. And then just as the darkness is threatening to consume everything, we get a little twist, a change if you will, perhaps even a glimmer of hope. The girlfriend is no longer a mere victim of the night, she's now a partner in unraveling the mysteries that plague the shared existence. It's kind of a hopeful note. Now, as we ponder the implications of this crazy tale, you can be left with like a lingering unease. What if the things that go bump in the night are not supernatural entities, but the unresolved questions that haunt our relationships? What if, in confronting the unknown, we find not terror, but the resilience of human spirit? And so, fellow folks out there in the vast digital wilderness, I leave you with this. What if, in the silence of the night, the questions we leave unanswered become the ghosts that linger, haunting our minds? I know I wanted to get kind of deep with it. Let me have my moment, okay? Number 3, the orangutans are skeptical of the changes in their cages. I love how much that rhymes, by the way. So folks, you know the drill by now. This nightmare is thanks to Zachary Adams, and let's just jump right into it. So we're gonna delve into this cryptic tale of a man caught in the web of his own perception. Kinda makes us, come face to face with a surreal narrative that challenges the very fabric of reality. The protagonist in this one, a self-proclaimed clam in the grand scheme of existence, weaves a narrative around the mundane aspects of his life. His inability to discern change, a quirk of its psyche, becomes a lens through which we explore the unsettling twists of his reality. Now, we meet a psychologist, a seemingly benevolent guide, and they kind of take on an eerie transformation, revealing layers of deception and manipulation that fracture the protagonist's understanding of his own existence. Now the tale unfolds in disjointed revelations, with each layer peeling back to expose a more disconcerting truth, kinda like an onion. The courtroom, a bastion of justice, morphs into a surreal arena where the boundaries between guilt and innocence blur. The protagonist's journey through psychiatric evaluations become a descent into a labyrinth of distorted perceptions, or even the physical environment becomes quite the enigma, if you will. The motif of stake, a seemingly trivial detail, evolves into a symbol of existential dissonance. The protagonist's insistence on the routine comfort of stake serves as a poignant metaphor for the human desire to cling to familiarity in the face of an ever-shifting reality. But then we get a little twist. Stake was never truly what it seemed to be, and it kinda shatters the illusions of stability, leaving the protagonist grasping at the fragments of his own understanding. I'm not gonna go into detail, but trust me, that twist got me. The psychologist's dual identity, donning disguises of both mentor and tormentor, mirrors a delicate dance between trust and betrayal that threads throughout the narrative. The laughter that echoes through the revelation of the protagonist's grim reality is a chilling crescendo, underscoring the fragility of the human, mind. As we traverse the corridors of the protagonist's mind, we are confronted with the unsettling notion that our perceptions, like our realities, maybe they're veiled in layers of illusion. The casual interchange between the protagonist and the psychologist, that's kind of full of cryptic references and philosophical undertones, mirrors the style of a mind grappling with the complexities of its own existence. In the end, as the protagonist confronts the horrifying truth of his own conception, both literally and metaphorically, we're kind of left with a lingering sense of unease. This whole narrative, it kind of invites us to question the nature of reality and the fragility of our perceptions. In the words of Shel Silverstein, It's all the same to a clam. But for the protagonist, the revelation of his own reality is a harrowing journey into the depths of the unknown. Number 2, I listened to a true crime podcast about myself. So next up we've got a scary story courtesy of one Robert Mort, which I love the name. You know, death, mort. Okay, that's my French coming out. So, we've all listened to podcasts, right? We love them. I have my favorites. But for this narrator, listening to it during a nightly stroll kind of transforms into quite a new reality. So, as they're immersing themselves in a true crime podcast, not my cup of tea, but do as you will, they realize, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. The podcast's ominous tale, delivered with an eerie calmness, begins to intertwine with the protagonist's reality. Like with the small town, the local store, the young student, all elements that echoes the threads of their own existence. Like, okay, that's me. That's me. Is this a coincidence? The protagonist's emotional journey is palpable as the podcast delves into the mysterious disappearance of a girl named Sarah Campbell. The parallels between the podcast narrative and our protagonist's life become increasingly uncanny. It's like, okay, this has gotta be me. Can't say I've ever had that happen yet, but who knows. The revelation that the victim shares the protagonist's name adds a layer of existential unease, as if the fabric of their own reality is unraveling faster than a ball of yarn. The narrative crescendos with the discovery of a pair of red Converse sneakers, mirroring the protagonist's own choice of footwear. Like for me, it'd be pink ankle boots. The podcast's ability to weave a tale that aligns so closely with the protagonist's experiences amplifies a sense of dread, inviting them and the audience to question the boundaries between fiction and reality. As the protagonist grapples with the unnerving possibility that the podcast is narrating their own story, the tension mounts. The arrival of a black SUV, the revelation of a registered offender named John Kelly, and the protagonist's frantic attempt to escape all of this contributes to the sense of impending danger. You know, that little yikes feeling in the back of your head? Also, the inclusion of Gabe, the protagonist's boyfriend, adds a twist that further blurs the line between, hey, is this my life? Gabe's unexpected appearance in the podcast narrative, coupled, with the revelation of a fabricated story about the protagonist's desire to run away, kinda shatters our narrator's sense of trust and stability. It's like, okay, well, game over for me. Now this podcast, with its hypnotic storytelling and ominous foreshadowing, becomes a malevolent force, seemingly orchestrating the protagonist's fate. The disconcerting blend of podcast narration and real-life events creates a narrative hall of mirrors, where truth and illusion are kind of dancing together in a haunting tandem. Now our protagonist tries to escape through a window at this point, fueled by a desperate need to distance themselves from the encroaching darkness, and it leaves the audience suspended in an unsettling denouement, if you will. Number 1, I just took a DNA test. Turns out I'm 100% in over my head. Look, I'm not the biggest fan of the concept of big companies owning part of my DNA, so while I didn't need the story from Sleepy Hollow 101 to scare me, maybe it'll chill some of y'all. So, once again, in today's day and age, who hasn't bought an Ancestry DNA kit apparently? Well, for this narrator, a seemingly innocent decision to explore their genetic makeup kind of unfolded into a perplexing tale that challenges, yeah, you guessed it, reality. So it began, they bought their test, promising insight into their heritage and the possibility to connect with long-lost kin. Because, who needs another cousin? It kind of takes a bit of a turn though when the option to share DNA data with law enforcement materializes. A choice made with, a noble intention to aid in solving crimes and bringing justice to victims, but little does the storyteller anticipate the crazy web that's going to unravel as a consequence of this seemingly innocent decision. The revelation that the storyteller's DNA is a partial match to an unidentified deceased woman kind of thrusts them into a, situation where we're kind of like, what the heck? The quest to identify this Jane Doe leads to a disconcerting revelation that the DNA match points to the storyteller's own family member, Bex. The ensuing discovery of 2 more exact matches to additional Jane and John Does compounds the mystery, creating a tapestry of inexplicable connections. Now, our storyteller grapples with the surreal nature of these revelations, seeking logical explanations that elude even the investigators. The absolute absurdity of the situation is magnified by the nonchalant response of Bex and Aunt Linda, who dismiss the DNA matches with laughter and shrugged shoulders, kind of making us go, huh? As the narrative unfolds, the disappearance of Bex, Ethan, and Aunt Linda adds another layer of complexity to the conundrum. Now our storyteller, caught in a bewildering whirlwind of events, oscillates between waiting for their return and the gnawing realization that the fabric of their family might be woven with the threads of quite the mystery. Now the police are equally as confounded by all of this and the disappearances, so they turn to the storyteller for any kind of information that might help, and the family's account of a prolonged vacation and the lack of substantial leads, yeah, the investigation kind of takes a turn. So in this crazy story, the boundaries, once again, between the reality and the inexplicable kind kind of turn it into a gray area, leaving the storyteller and us suspended in, limbo. The quest for ancestral knowledge transforms into a chilling exploration of the unknown, where the threads of family history become kind of intertwined with a cosmic riddle that defies the conventions of reason. Now, as the narrative concludes, the unresolved mystery lingers, casting a shadow over the storyteller's quest for identity. The enigma of the DNA matches and the vanishing of family members kind of remains shrouded in ambiguity.
Coming in at number 5, I want details.
Coming in our number 5 spot, killer living in your home. Now this one is super creepy. It's about a killer who actually secretly lived in the family's home for weeks before killing them. This took place in 1922 in a small isolated farm in Germany. Everything was normal and the family were doing their daily routines when all of a sudden things just started to vanish with no explanation. Keys went missing, objects would not be in their usual spot, and weird footprints were spotted around their land. Then one night the family began to hear footsteps in their attic. But for whatever reason, they didn't think much of it, and they just ignored it. But they probably should have checked it out because a week later, the husband, wife, daughter, 2 grandchildren, and the maid were brutally killed by an axe-wielding maniac. And it just so happens he was living in their attic. The family's bodies were discovered 4 days later, and until this day, no one knows who the killer was. Coming in our number 4 spot, the pig pen of death. Turns out some pigs are as into eating us as we are into eating them. In Oregon, a Vietnam War vet started to raise pigs as a form of treatment for his post-traumatic stress disorder. Things were going great and the pigs were a huge distraction. But then one day in 2012, this man went to feed his pigs and never came back. His family went out to look for him, and when they got to the pen, all they saw were his dentures, a few pieces of fabric, and flesh. It's unclear what exactly happened. Maybe the man had a heart attack, or maybe the pigs were just hungry. But whatever reason, these pigs devoured him. At number 3, woman with headache discovers unwelcome guest in her brain. A 31-year-old woman went on a sunny vacation to Mexico and had a blast. She came back and everything was fine for about 2 years, but then she began suffering from severe headaches and vision problems. She went to see a doctor and they told her she had translucent jelly-like sacs sitting on her brain. And if it's possible to get any worse, each of these contained a baby tapeworm. The doctors informed her it was likely she picked up the parasite during her trip to Mexico. Which, when you think about it, is super creepy because she had gone to Mexico 2 years prior. So basically this parasite was just sitting on her brain for 2 years. And at number 2, man checks malfunctioning oven and gets trapped inside. One day, a huge industrial oven in a British factory just stopped working. So a supervisor decided to inspect it. He jumped inside and began to check it out. But what he didn't know was another worker actually fixed it just minutes earlier. The same employee returned shortly after, and not knowing anyone was inside, he turned the oven back on. And to make matters worse, this man was engaged to the supervisor's daughter. So basically he just set his father-in-law on fire. Now you might think there was a small chance of him getting out or screaming for help, but unfortunately once the oven is turned on, the doors automatically slam shut and lock, so no one would have been able to hear him. His body was only discovered after employees noticed smoke blowing out of the oven.
Well, at number 5 we have the story of the gas man. Reddit user Ligamentary tells a tale from the 1960s where her and her older sister were home alone for the weekend. It was a different time where people were generally less security conscious. She was waiting for a friend to pick her up when there was a slight knock on the door. Thinking that it was her friend, she answered without checking the peephole. It was a man standing there claiming that he was the gas man and he needed to check their meter. Disappointed that it wasn't her friend, she allowed the man in. She didn't notice this at the time, but the man wasn't dressed as a city official would, but he had a green and purple striped shirt on like the host of Blue's Clues. Immediately the man headed upstairs to the girls' bedrooms, just as her older sister passed him on the landing. "Why is that man going upstairs?" her sister asked. She replied that he was just reading the gas meters. Her sister turned pale. "Our gas meters are outside." Ever resourceful, her old sister had a stroke of genius and a man was passing outside the house when she yelled, "Oh Dad, it's good that you're home. There's a man here to read the gas meters upstairs." Just like that, the man in the striped shirt bolted out of the house. Close call? Well, you bet, because just 3 months later, a girl went missing under the exact same circumstances. She was home alone with no signs of forced entry. They later found the girl's body. She'd been held captive for a few days and then burned alive. Coming in at number 4, The Drums of War Woman Dal. Now, this one is a little short but sweet and completely terrifying if you have a morbid fear of the unknown. Reddit user Coughcakes, great name, shared this unnerving tale to strike fear into the heart of campers everywhere. It was the year 2000 and he had spent a year at Aspen Youth Alternatives, a wilderness survival camp that taught young people the importance of independent survival and self-reliance. During one of their more remote hikes, they ventured off trail and made camp near a place called War Woman Dal. It was a beautiful location, but many of the campers said it just felt a little bit off. There was a strange silence in the air that didn't quite make sense, and an absence of something that they couldn't quite put their finger on. There were 15 campers sleeping in groups of 3 and 2 staff members that took turns on a night shift, keeping up an eye in the woods. Gradually, he started to hear a faint rhythm in the distance, slowly getting louder and louder. Thinking that it was all in his head, he asked the girl next to him if she could hear it too. At first she said no, but then it got louder and closer, and she could definitely hear the drums. Thinking it was the kids, a staff member hollered at them to knock it off. It was time to get to sleep, but the drums just kept getting louder. By this time, the whole group were out of their tents, looking at each other, staring off in bewilderment. A few of the campers were stood still, tears streaming down their faces. The drums lasted until daybreak. Needless to say, the group quickly left the trail. Smart move, thankfully. Next up at number 3, not my boyfriend. Now, this one creeped me out a little bit, so let's hope we never run into this person. Reddit user HeartX3 Jess lived with her boyfriend in their swanky downtown apartment. She worked from home and her boyfriend was a teacher in a town about 15 minutes away by train. He got home pretty much the exact same time every single day. Pay attention to that detail because it's important. Well, Jess and her boyfriend had been in a pretty big fight. The kind of fight where you don't even speak to each other, call or text. At this particular juncture, Jess was lying on her bed, roughly the time that her boyfriend was due home, and she was ready to make amends. She was preparing herself for that awkward, hey, shall we stop fighting kind of smile. She had earplugs in, but she could hear his heavy footsteps walking around the apartment, waiting for him to finally head to the bedroom. The door opened slowly, just a few inches. She turned her head towards the door, but it stayed still this time. Jess could see a reflection on the doorknob. It wasn't her boyfriend's hand, but a woman's hand with dark red nail polish. Whoever it was, they slowly closed the door just as they had opened it. As you would, she freaked out and hid on the balcony as she frantically called her boyfriend. Was it his mum or sister who came to visit? No, they didn't have keys. The landlady? No, she always lets them know a day in advance. Nevertheless, her boyfriend said, "Don't move, I'm calling the police." The mystery remained unsolved, not a person in sight, but the next day, when the landlady was changing the locks, they found a strange, square area by the keyhole that had been scratched away by something. Tools. Someone had forced their way inside. Spooky, eh? Coming in at number 2, Gilbert, Arizona. This one is definitely a doozy, so strap on in. It's the late 90s and Reddit user Can610, who was 14 at the time, moved from Phoenix to Gilbert, Arizona, which at the time was just beginning to develop from a town into a bigger city. Previously, most of the land around Gilbert had been rich, well-used farmland, and it had a long line of rural history. Now, Can610 was the oldest of 7 kids, and although their house was always bustling with noise and activity, the family quickly noticed that there were a number of strange noises that would occur. The house was brand new, mind, and the land around it nothing but cornfields. One night she was having some friends over for a slumber party. As is custom at these kind of events, the talk quickly turned to ghost stories. The Hookman, rat-a-tat. They laughed at how lame they were until they heard a strange shuffling outside their room. Someone dared her to take a look. Who knows, perhaps maybe it's a ghost. So feeling brave, she did and quietly crept down the hallway. As she got to the end of the house, she noticed that the back door was actually wide open. Strange, everyone in the house was asleep. Stranger still, someone had tracked mud all over the floor. The footsteps didn't seem to move in a straight line either. They had a strange property about them. It was a thick, consistent layer of mud, almost too perfect to be an actual footprint. She screamed and the slumber party ran down the hallway to her. As they huddled together, they all saw the exact same thing. Standing just beside the TV was a small boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He wore nothing but plain denim overalls and was filthy, covered in mud. For a moment he looked at the girls with a sad, somber look, and then just like that, he was gone. The next morning, the mud had completely disappeared except for 2 dirty footprints by the back door and a dried mud mark on the outside doorknob. Maybe he left, or maybe he was always there. And finally, at a number 1 spot, Goatman while camping. Now, if you are aware of the legend of the Anansi Goatman, then you'll easily be able to fill in some of these gaps in this story because there's a lot left to the imagination. It's 2007, and Reddit user Coyotes was out with a couple of friends camping in the woods. 13 of them, kids between the ages of 16 and 18, just wanted to have a few beers at the weekend in relative peace and feel like adults. They'd planned to stay for 4 to 5 days over the the summer vacation, but little did they know what would transpire. On the first night around 7 PM, they heard something or someone moving in the bushes. They threw an empty beer bottle, heard it smashed, and slowly watched something or someone climb out of the bushes and lumber back into the trees. That'd be the first warning for me to get out. Later that night, as they slept in their tents, they heard a strange popping sound coming from the fire. They shot up out of bed to find the fire that was previously just dying coals, roaring with flames as if someone had poured gasoline on it. Well, obviously no one had. It was then that they began to smell a scent like no other. At first they thought it was a skunk, but then they realized it was more like the smell of rotten meat. Then they heard a soft voice coming from the line of trees. The group stopped. One of them, named Ben, cried out, "Oi, who's there?" Silence. And then, in a similar but eerily not quite right imitation, the sound of a reply. "Oi, who's there?" And then a figure emerged, maybe 40 or so feet away. "Oi, who's there?" it said again. The group stood transfixed. It was only then that they noticed the figure looked eerily familiar. It was the double of their friend Ben that had shouted out into the woods, in every likeness, except that it wasn't him. It stared at them for what seemed like hours, even as they hurriedly packed away their camp into their cars. Every now and then, it would cry, "Oi, who's there?"
Kicking off this list, in 5th place, we've got attempted insemination. For safety's sake, since I have a lovely lexicon of no-no words to avoid, ask someone in the comments if y'all are confused about my wording at any point. 19-year-old Tanner met 22-year-old Miranda through Tinder while they attended the same college. And the first time they hung out, it was a casual Netflix hangout at Miranda's place, and he left thinking she was decent and wasn't against making future plans. They started texting and Snapchatting throughout the following week and organized some plans for the upcoming weekend. Out of nowhere, she started sending him unsolicited fun pics. He has very adamantly stated that he never once asked for them, and while they were hanging out the weekend prior, there was no fun activity at any level. While it caught him off guard, he wasn't put off by the advances. Fast forward to the weekend, Miranda and Tanner are hanging out at his place with his roommates when she asks if she can stay the night, and Tanner agrees to it. Being a gentleman, he offered to take the couch, but she mentioned she'd rather share his bed, something he's open to. As things move to the bedroom, they engage in consensual intercourse, with Tanner shedding his condom after the event's end. After lying together for a few minutes, Miranda gets up abruptly, grabs the condom off the floor, and runs into the bathroom. Tanner was a little confused, maybe a little concerned, but didn't read too much into it until he heard a loud crash in the bathroom, Miranda cursing, followed by no response to his query if she needed help. Out of concern, thinking she fell and, cracked her head open or something, he approached the washroom, witnessing Miranda standing in his shower with one leg propped up, trying to shove the condom up her, hoo-ha after she had flipped it inside out. Tanner rightfully panicked and slammed the door, unsure of how to act. Miranda quickly left, and Tanner never heard from her ever again. While this story might not seem as horrific as others to come, it definitely left my mind boggled. In 4th place, we have a multifaceted date. On a random lonely fall day, resident lonely heart Nicholas was swiping and matched up with a lovely looking lady named Holly and sent off a hello to kickstart a conversation. While I might not be much of a dating app expert, that's quite often a long shot way of catching attention, but hey, it worked. Holly immediately offered to meet up, and Nicholas jumped at the offer, with the duo deciding to meet at a nearby frozen yogurt spot. When he arrived, Holly was already deep in a bowl of dessert, so he purchased his own serving and joined her, with the duo exchanging the usual small talk to break the ice. Eventually, the topic of school came up, and at the time, Nicholas was a junior in college, so he told Holly about what he was studying and that he wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to do after he graduated. She laughed in response, saying she knew exactly what he meant. Who doesn't? Holly explained that throughout her time in high school, she regularly wore men's clothing and as a result, had an interest in designing men's clothes. So naturally, Nicholas asked if she was studying fashion, and she responded by telling him that she hated high school so much that she decided not to go to college, which, honestly I can kind of understand. She continued by saying that she was a very creative person, and that she was writing a book before also casually mentioning how she was in the process of starting a photography company. Nicholas asked how those were going, and she said that they were more theoretical than reality at that point, going on to explain that her backup plan, if none of the other endeavors panned out, was to become a surgeon. Although she lacked any of the training for it, Holly gleefully told Nicholas that she could see herself going down that path because she wasn't afraid of red bodily fluids and gore, which grossed Nicholas out. Without prompting, Holly continued by telling him that she was certain she could handle the graphic nature of being a surgeon because she personally euthanized a sheep that past summer, describing the ending in detail, going as far as mimicking the human-like shriek that the animal made when she ended it. Now this is where most people would probably start, making a run for it, but Nicholas was determined to see if there was more to this wild tale. Alright, Holly went more in depth with details, claiming that her family regularly euthanized goats and sheep as part of rituals for their strong shaman background. She hushed her voice as she leaned in and said that her religion had actually gifted her with psychic powers, which manifested as voices in her head, and those voices were so strong that they were telling her exactly what to write in that book that she had already mentioned. At this point, Nicholas finally made an excuse to leave, blocking her, and never heard from her ever again. In third place, we've got a scummy rich man. 20-year-old Allison worked in a sushi restaurant all during college, and one fateful night noticed an attractive man and his friend during a crazy dinner rush. She described herself as running around like crazy, but managed to give them good service, and in return they tipped well, making them memorable. After the shift, she was at home enjoying an adult beverage and mindlessly swiping on Tinder, trying to recover from all the craziness of the night, when she spotted a profile matching the man from earlier, who was easy to recognize from his distinctive face and tattoos. She took a chance, swiped right, and fell asleep from exhaustion. The next day, she woke up to find out that they had matched, and he'd sent some pretty sweet messages. She decided to engage in conversation, finding out he was in town for business, and he proceeded to ask her out for dinner that night at a fancy restaurant. Thanks to encouragement from her roomies, Allison said yes. The man originally insisted on picking her up, but thankfully, Allison was adamant on canceling the date if he continued. If you ask me, red flag number 1 for this gal. The two met up at said fancy restaurant, where the man proceeded to order a $200 bottle of wine, lobster, and more, with Allison guessing that the total cost of the meal was somewhere in the $600 range. Whoa, I balk at like a $20 meal, but that's just me. Apparently the conversation started out normal enough, but Allison soon found out that not only was the man married, but allegedly he was in an open relationship. Rightfully, she didn't believe him, so he called his wife on the spot after texting her photos of Allison. Apparently the wife was bi, and asked her husband to invite Allison to their home in Cancun for some fun together. Red flag number 2. Once the call ended, Allison decided to ask the man how he afforded his lifestyle, and he casually mentioned that it was through a drug cartel, quickly trying to reassure her though that it was all safe and on the up and up. Being a sensible person, Allison immediately tried to leave, but he followed her to her car. He was showing her photos of his wife, saying that she should really go to Cancun with them, and that she owes it to him to go back to his hotel room, since he spent so much on dinner. Finally, trying to force her to kiss him. Allison was eventually able to get into her car and get away, but was terrified he was going to follow her home. So she drove around for a while, and eventually opted to spend the night at a male friend's home for safety. Oh, and deleted Tinder the moment she got home. In second place, we have a first date gone sour. User Teeny Gecko on Reddit is to thank for sharing this horror tale with the interwebs, and since my tongue is in the mood to trip today, for simplicity's sake, I'll refer to her as Teeny. During a day of mindless swiping, she came across the profile of a guy named Carlos, thought he was cute, and as one does, swiped right, which resulted in an instant match. They chatted for a while and made plans to meet up at a local carnival at 9 p.m. the next night. Teeny arrived on time but heard nothing from Carlos until he called her at 9:30, claiming to have overslept from a nap, and she told him not to bother showing up, saying they'd try again another time. Unfortunately for our romantic pairing, Teeny's dad suddenly took ill, and she spent the next 6 weeks visiting him daily in the hospital. And between that and work, didn't really have time to date, which made Carlos angry. He made a fake Instagram account, which he used to follow Teeny and everyone that she followed. One night in particular, Teeny's sister had flown into town to visit their dad, and they had gone out to dinner with a group of friends, which had been posted to a friend's public Instagram story. Carlos showed up at the restaurant to confront Teeny, yelling all sorts of profanities. Yeah, I don't think I can say those. And thankfully, a waiter who witnessed the entire exchange called the police. For over 10 months, since Carlos had Teeny's number, he kept calling her using different phones, and she'd pick up the phone to hear only the sound of him breathing. One day in particular, Teeny was expecting a call from a friend and noticed a missed call from a landline she thought belonged to that friend, so she called it back and wound up talking to Carlos's mom. She took the opportunity to tell his mom everything, shaking the entire time, worried the mom wouldn't believe her. Now, lucky for Teeny, not only did the mom believe her, but begged Teeny not to call the cops, but to call her directly if she ever heard from Carlos ever again. Thankfully, there's a happy ending to this listing because Carlos never contacted Teeny ever again. In our first place today, we have a stalker. Just a warning for y'all out there watching, this is probably the most my stomach has ever been nauseous while working on a video. In terms of content warning, I will be discussing life ending, so if that's triggering for you, please just skip to the conclusion or feel free to skedaddle. I promise you're not gonna hurt my feelings. Our story begins the same as the rest, with 21-year-old Britt scrolling through Tinder, finding a 27-year-old named Matt that seemed pretty neat. They worked in the same industry, both enjoyed Star Wars and other fandoms, so she swiped right. Of course they matched, or else I wouldn't be talking about this icky tale today. They talked for hours that first night and realized they had mutual friends, so Brett felt safe enough to meet up with Matt for a public date. The date went well and evolved into a steady relationship. Things were never perfect, with Matt being somewhat transparent about struggling with some mental health issues, but they were undeniably in love. Matt was constantly posting on Instagram about how much Britt was the one, and she was thrilled. After 4 months of being together, the couple had their first fight, arguing over a reaction Matt had to Britt joking with a coworker about safety. Britt suggested they take a small break to regroup, feeling unsafe with the level of anger Matt had shown, which led Matt to scream at Britt in the public setting they were in and stalking off. That night, on Instagram, he claimed he was going to end his life, posting videos of a nearby mountain cliff saying he was going to jump. Britt and other friends of Matt's were rightfully concerned, and with enough of them calling the police, he was apprehended before he could, but was released from police custody that same night. Britt still cared for Matt, but was rightfully in shock from the events and had taken a pause from texting him to figure out her mental state. The next day, he showed up to a regularly scheduled brunch date that he and Britt would attend with her friends, but looked at his own table, silently watching the group from a distance until that group of friends decided to just abandon the location and escort Britt safely home. Later that night, Matt took to Instagram claiming he'd been forgotten already, wishing that no one should ever see the day they'd be treated like a freak, and many other tangents about being ignored and abandoned. The day after, he posted a long essay to social media, claiming he'd come to his senses and was going to take a break to clear his head, also sending a personalized essay to Britt about not wanting to hurt her, but how much he loved her and wanted them to get back together. Britt chose not to respond and debated blocking all his information. His hiatus from social media didn't happen, and Matt posted endless blocks of text for the next 2 weeks about how people like him don't deserve happy endings, that he would never forgive himself, and listing all the interests he could no longer enjoy because of Britt leaving his life. The last straw for Britt was when he posted artwork of her with her favorite book character, writing a fictionalized accompanying story about her perfect summer vacation without him. She blocked his number and every social media platform she could think of, but Matt was determined to make her take him back. Through a friend, he found out about yet another social event Britt was attending and posted publicly about going, just to see her again, and actually showed up at this event. This led Britt to involve the police, opting to start the long process for a restraining order. Over the next 2 months leading up to her first court date, Matt publicly claimed to attempt to end himself no less than a dozen times, with multiple countdowns, flipping between claiming that Britt was cruel and abandoned him, but also that he needed her and the other friends that had since cut ties with him back. He would call her number and leave voicemails, had bookmarked an anonymous app that she had previously used for public questions to send her statements to please take him back, but also asking how much guilt she would feel about celebrating his death and more. I'd be here for over an hour if I went in depth about just how much this guy posted over those months. He would post photos of them together and regularly list off names of people that had cut him off. Finally, the day came for the first court appearance, and despite Matt's claims of wanting to see her, he didn't appear. He later posted that he thought the summons was just a scare tactic and started yet another death day countdown, this time alleging that he wanted to jump off the roof of Britt's building and haunt her for the rest of her life. Eventually, he was sentenced to prison for his actions, and I've never been happier to see a peaceful ending. And now that I feel like deactivating all my social media accounts, that's finally the end of today's list.